Did you know that in the forgotten eras before recorded history, ancient storytellers whispered of a war older than kingdoms, older than stone, older even than the memory of humankind itself? They spoke of a time when the world was not silent, when the air carried the echo of celestial footsteps, and when the borders between heaven and earth were thin enough for angels to descend and for giants to rise. Across deserts that had no name, beneath skies unbroken by towers or cities, something moved, something vast, watching, waiting, its shadow stretching over the newborn world like a prophecy. In the ancient world, few stories stirred both fear and wonder, quite like the tales of the Watchers and the Nephilim. They were said to have stood as tall as cedar trees, with voices like storm winds and minds burdened by forbidden knowledge. Some claimed they came as teachers, others said they came as conquerors, but all agreed on one thing: their presence changed the destiny of Earth forever. The question that lingers like a trembling chord through time is simple and haunting. Why did these mighty beings, born of heaven's brilliance and earth's longing, rise against the very order that shaped them? What stirred their rebellion? What broke the boundary between the mortal and the divine? And why do their ruins still seem to breathe beneath the sands and mountains, as though remembering the weight of a forgotten war? Tonight, as you settle into stillness and the world around you falls quiet, we will reopen that ancient door. We will walk through landscapes lost to floods and fire, hearing the soft tremor of wings overhead and the slow, thunderous heartbeat of giants beneath the soil. We will follow whispered scriptures, fragments of mythology, and the trembling memory of civilizations long gone. Every step will draw you deeper into the mystery of a conflict that shaped humanity's earliest fears and its earliest hopes. If this journey stirs something in you, feel free to join others who walk this path by sharing your thoughts below. Your voice becomes part of this unfolding story, another echo in the vast chamber of ancient memory. Now, let us peer into the ages before the ages and trace the secret war that set heaven and earth on divergent paths and awakened the giants. Before the first stories were carved into clay, before the earliest shepherd lifted his eyes to measure the constellations, the world lay in a silence so profound it almost felt alive. Dawn did not yet break across nations, for there were no nations, only endless stretches of earth, untouched and unclaimed, breathing beneath a heaven that watched with ancient patience. Mountains still carried the heat of their birth. Rivers wandered without names, carving paths that only time would remember. Forests grew thick with shadows, and every whisper of wind felt like the earliest hint of a language not yet spoken. In that young world, humanity walked softly, as if fearing it might stir something vast beneath the soil. They lived close to the rhythms of creation, feeling the pulse of the earth through their bare feet and sensing the quiet presence of forces beyond their understanding. Nights were darker then, deeper, more complete. The stars were brighter, too so bright that early tribes believed they were not distant fires, but open eyes gazing down upon them. Eyes that seemed to shimmer with intention. It was during such nights that the first tremors of awareness touched the human spirit. Around small fires that pushed back the darkness only a little, they felt it, a presence beyond the edges of their sight, neither threatening nor comforting, yet immense. Something watched from the high places. Something lingered in the air, in the hush before the wind returned, in the way shadows stretched a little too long and too thin. They did not yet have a name for these watchers, but they sensed them as surely as a child senses an unseen figure at the doorway. As generations passed, humanity grew bolder. They learned the shapes of seasons, the migrations of herds, the hidden rhythm of seeds. Yet even as they tamed the world with their hands, the feeling of being observed never faded. When they climbed hills to greet the morning, they often paused at the summit, overcome by the strange impression that they were standing on the threshold of another realm. Sometimes, in the fragile stillness before dawn, they felt something brush the edge of their consciousness, like the faint, trailing wing of a thought, not their own. There were stories whispered even then, though no one had yet carved words into stone. Stories of luminous figures, glimpsed on the high ridges at twilight, standing perfectly still, as though listening to the heartbeat of the world. Stories of dreams, visited by beings who spoke in harmonies rather than voices, leaving the sleeper trembling with awe. Stories of a beauty so fierce and gentle that it filled the soul with longing without knowing for what. The elders spoke of these moments in hushed tones. They said the sky was not empty. They said the heavens were inhabited by the first and oldest order of beings, creatures born in radiance, bound to laws older than stars. Beings who looked upon the earth, not with indifference, but with deep and solemn responsibility. They believed these unseen watchers walked the boundary between worlds, guarding something precious, perhaps even fragile, within humanity. Yet humanity had no understanding of the scale of such guardianship. They merely felt the brush of eternity grazing their simple days. Still, there was a growing sense, subtle, like the breath before a storm, that something was about to change. The air thickened with anticipation. Even nature seemed to hold its breath. There were nights when the clouds glowed faintly without moon or lightning. Nights when flocks of birds took flight long after sunset, as though startled by an unseen presence rising from the earth. Nights when distant mountain peaks flickered with pale fire, too silent to be flame, too soft to be lightning. Some asked, was the world preparing for something? Was heaven drawing nearer, or was the earth shifting toward a destiny not yet revealed? The boundary between realms trembled. The watchers were stirring, and humanity, though unaware of what was approaching, could feel the weight of an unseen future pressing gently against the edges of their existence. A dawn was coming that would change everything, a dawn not born from sunlight, but from descent. As the early light began to stretch its pale fingers across the horizon, the sky seemed to shimmer with a subtle tension, as though holding back a revelation too immense for mortal eyes. Dawn had always been a quiet unveiling, a soft awakening of color and warmth. But in those ancient days, something within the morning itself felt altered, heightened, listening. It was as if the heavens leaned closer each time the sun rose, studying the world with growing intent. In the stillness of these mornings, humanity often paused in their humble tasks. Hunters would lift their spears a little slower. Gatherers would stand among the dew-covered grasses, gazing upward as though expecting a voice to call down. Even children felt it, the strange hum in the air, the invisible presence that brushed the back of the mind like a gentle, lingering thought. They spoke quietly of shapes glimpsed against the sky, shapes too graceful to be birds, too silent to be spirits of wind. Across the plains, in the slate-gray shadows of newly formed mountains, tribes began to speak of dreams shared among them. Dreams of beings draped in light, standing upon the ridges with expressions unreadable yet tender. Dreams of voices that were not voices at all, but chords of emotion, peace, sorrow, warning woven into a single, trembling note that echoed long after waking. These visions left dreamers breathless, their hearts caught between fear and longing, unable to discern whether they had been blessed or called. The world itself seemed to respond. Rivers glowed faintly some nights, mirroring pale lights that moved across the skies. Trees swayed in windless air, their leaves trembling with a reverence that humans could feel but not interpret. Even the animals became restless, lifting their heads toward unseen movements, their instincts sharpening with a sense of imminent change. Nature, ever the vessel of silent truths, whispered that something vast approached from beyond the mortal veil. And then came the signs humanity could no longer ignore. A strange resonance that rippled through the earth, not an earthquake, not a storm, but a pulse of existence itself. It rolled beneath their feet like a low, distant drumbeat, awakening ancient echoes in the soil. The elders interpreted it as the stirrings of the unseen realm, the first footfall of beings preparing to step into the world of flesh and breath. They warned their tribes to show reverence to the heights, to keep watch over the horizon, for the heavens were no longer silent. They were right, for on a twilight unlike any before it, the sky deepened, not into darkness, but into a brilliance that seemed to peel open the very fabric of the firmament. Colors unfurled that had no names, hues that trembled between fire and water, light and shadow. And within that shimmering veil, outlines appeared, tall, impossibly tall, graceful, radiant, bearing the weight of eternity in their stillness. Humanity fell to their knees, not out of fear, but out of instinct, as though their souls recognized something their eyes could not yet comprehend. The Watchers had stepped to the threshold at last. Their presence was quiet, reverent, a visitation rather than a conquest. Yet even in this silence, the air throbbed with celestial power, the kind that could shape worlds or shatter them. The Watchers did not descend that night, not fully. But they observed. Their luminous forms drifted above the mountains and plains, studying humanity with a compassion tinged by something older duty, perhaps, or destiny. Their eyes, bright as molten gold, reflected the fragility of human life, yet also its astonishing potential. They saw innocence and violence, tenderness and ambition, and within it all, a spark that mirrored the divine. Humanity would remember this night not as a visitation, but as a promise, a subtle turning of the age. For once, the Watchers revealed themselves, even in part. The world could never again return to its quiet, untroubled dawns. A bridge had been glimpsed between realms, and though it remained untraveled, its existence changed everything. The sky closed again, the colors fading, the veil mending. But the memory lingered in every heartbeat and every whisper beneath the stars. The dawn of the ancient world had shifted forever. The Watchers had looked upon humanity, and humanity had felt the gaze of heaven. And deep within that gaze, a question formed, one that would shape the ages to come. What happens when beings of light step beyond their appointed boundaries? In the days that followed the Watchers' first unveiling, the world moved with a strange and delicate tension, as though creation itself stood poised between breath and exhale. Humanity resumed its simple tasks, gathering food, tending fires, shaping stones, but everything felt subtly altered. The air seemed more alive, as if it carried secrets resting just beneath its surface. Even sunlight broke differently across the earth, catching motes of dust that drifted like tiny sparks, as though remnants of the night sky still clung to the morning. The people found themselves glancing upward far more often. A lone hunter on a ridge would pause, sensing an unseen movement just beyond the edge of vision. A shepherd, guiding his flock through tall grass, would feel a soft warmth on his back, turning to find nothing but empty sky. Mothers and fathers held their children closer when the wind shifted, for sometimes it carried faint harmonies, notes so subtle they could be mistaken for echoes of memory, yet so profound they stirred an ache in the heart. Around the fires at night, the elders spoke carefully. They warned the people not to seek the Watchers, for beings born of heaven moved according to laws humanity could not fathom. But even in their caution, their voices held reverence. They remembered ancient stories passed down long before words found form in symbols. Stories that hinted at moments when the heavens had neared the earth, when beings of light walked the high places, guiding unseen histories. Stories of a world still young enough to be shaped. Yet beneath this wonder, a quieter emotion began to take root: curiosity. Humanity had glimpsed the boundary of another realm, and though they did not dare to cross it, they longed to understand why it had opened. Why now? Why them? Why would beings clothed in radiance turn their eyes toward a world so small, so fragile? This yearning filled their dreams, spreading like ripples through their villages. Men and women awoke with eyes glistening from visions they could not articulate, visions of towering forms gazing upon them with a strange tenderness, visions of paths that stretched into blinding oceans of light. Not all dreams were peaceful. A few awoke trembling, whispering of watchers whose eyes held not only compassion, but a sorrow older than the mountains. These dreamers felt that the watchers observed humanity not merely with interest, but with a burden and unspoken weight they carried across realms. Something within the heavens had shifted, and humanity stood on the verge of witnessing its consequences. Meanwhile, nature mirrored these subtle upheavals. The winds changed, moving in patterns that defied the seasons. Streams overflowed briefly without rainfall, only to recede as though nothing had happened. Birds migrated in unusual arcs, spiraling across the sky as if following pathways visible only to them. The earth was responding, aligning itself with a cosmic rhythm that humans could feel but not decipher. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and painted the plains in amber fire, a young man named Errol wandered from his tribe, drawn by a faint glow upon the distant hills. The elders had forbidden such ventures, yet something within him, a quiet pull, soft as a whispered name, beckoned him forward. He climbed the slope, breath quickening with a mixture of fear and wonder, until he stood upon the crest. There, stretching across the valley below, shimmered threads of light, delicate, wavering, drifting, as if suspended between worlds. They moved like the slow unfurling of a curtain, revealing glimpses of silhouettes behind them, tall silhouettes, radiant silhouettes. The watchers, they did not touch the earth. They hovered just above it, their forms shifting like reflections upon water. Errol felt no fear, only a profound stillness, as though time itself had paused to watch. The watchers turned their luminous faces toward him, and in that instant, Errol understood something, without being told. The watchers were not merely observing humanity. They were waiting for what he could not know. But the world felt poised on the edge of an unfolding story, and he sensed that even the smallest choices of humankind might soon echo in the halls of heaven. He returned to his tribe, changed, quieter, reflective, carrying within him the weight of a vision he could barely describe. Those who looked into his eyes felt the shift too. Something was drawing near, something vast enough to bend the course of nations not yet born. The watchers had revealed themselves in signs and shadows, in dreams and threads of light. But soon, the boundary between realms would open fully. Soon, descent would become reality, and the ancient world, still trembling in its early dawn, would never be the same again. For many nights after the watchers revealed themselves in glimmers and shadows, the sky carried a restless expectancy, as though holding its breath before an inevitable unveiling. Humanity sensed it in subtle tremors that stirred the soul, an unseen ripple moving through the fabric of existence. Fires crackled differently. Winds paused at odd intervals. Dawn arrived with an unfamiliar hush, as though light itself approached more slowly, reverently, aware that something sacred was drawing near. Then, one night unlike any before, the sky unfurled. It began with a single point of brilliance, a star that did not belong to the familiar constellations. It pulsed with a steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of heaven itself. Its glow deepened, expanded, and soon threads of shimmering radiance spilled outward across the firmament. These threads moved not with the drifting grace of clouds, but with deliberate intent, folding and unfolding, weaving a vast, celestial tapestry. Villages across plains and mountains awoke to the glow. Men and women stumbled from their tents and dwellings, shielding their eyes as the heavens rippled open. Children clung to their parents, trembling not with fear but with awe. Even the animals grew still, gazing upward as though recognizing a presence older than instinct. From the heart of that shining veil stepped forms so beautiful, so wondrous, that human language trembled before them. The Watchers had descended. They came without thunder, without the violence of storms or the roar of armies. Their arrival was silent, serene, like the falling of snow upon untouched ground. Yet that silence carried a force beyond comprehension. Their bodies were tall, taller than the greatest of men, and clothed in light that ebbed and flowed with soft luminosity. Wings folded behind them like veils of living radiance, each feather pulsing with subtle hues of gold and white. Their faces shone with a gentleness that felt ancient, as if sculpted before the birth of time itself. And their eyes, those eyes held the depth of distant stars, the resolve of cosmic law, and beneath it all, something that humanity could not yet understand: longing. The first to step upon the earth was Arachiel, a watcher whose presence radiated both authority and compassion. When his feet touched the soil, the ground hummed, not in trembling fear, but in recognition. It was as though creation itself welcomed him. Behind him came others, luminous beings who spread across the highlands and valleys, observing the world with expressions that blended solemn duty with profound curiosity. Humanity fell to their knees, not by command but by instinct. The Watchers had not come to frighten them. Their descent was a gesture of closeness, a drawing near, motivated by a desire older than the mountains. They had been appointed guardians, teachers, meant to guide the fragile yet extraordinary beings who bore the divine imprint upon their souls. Yet, as the Watchers surveyed humanity, something within them stirred something unexpected. They saw the vulnerability of mortals, their trembling hands, their wide eyes, their breath misting in the cool night air. They saw the innocence of children, the tenderness with which families clung together, the hope that flickered in their faces like tiny flames. And in these fragile qualities, the Watchers felt a warmth blooming in their celestial hearts, a warmth they had not anticipated. For the Watchers were beings of order, beings shaped by obedience to divine law. Emotion was a distant horizon to them, a thing observed but never embraced. Yet standing upon the earth, breathing the same air as the humans they were meant to guide, something shifted within their essence. The boundaries they had once upheld with clarity now blurred. Earthly life wrapped itself around them in scents, sights, and sensations so vivid that they seemed intoxicating. Arachiel felt it most keenly. As he walked among the humans, he sensed their trust, their wonder, their fear tinged with admiration. Their hearts were open in a way no celestial being had ever been permitted to witness so closely. Their lives, though brief, burned with intensity, each moment rich with meaning and struggle. Something within him, something dangerous and deeply human, began to awaken, and so it was with the others. What began as solemn guardianship slowly transformed into fascination. The Watchers found themselves lingering near the communities they were meant to observe. They watched parents cradle newborns, watched young couples whisper promises beneath the stars, watched grief and joy weave through daily life with raw, unfiltered beauty. And with every passing day, the Watchers felt themselves drawn closer, not to their mission, but to the people themselves. The descent, meant to be temporary, began to take root. Heaven had sent them to teach, earth had invited them to feel. And in that fragile space between purpose and desire, a rebellion began to grow, not loud, not sudden, but quiet as dawn, inevitable as the tide. In the weeks that followed their arrival, the Watchers walked the earth with a grace that both comforted and unsettled the hearts of those who beheld them. They did not eat, though they observed meals with quiet fascination. They did not sleep, though they often stood beneath the stars, as though listening to distant echoes carried on the night wind. Humanity approached them timidly at first, offering crafted bowls, woven cloth, carved stones, small tokens of gratitude and reverence. The watchers accepted these gifts with solemn bows, gestures filled with humility rather than superiority. Arakiel spent his days among the shepherds, drawn to the simple harmony of their lives. He crouched beside them as they tended their flocks, studying the tender way a shepherd would lift a lamb from a thicket, murmuring reassurance to calm its trembling. He watched children chase sunlight across the grasses, laughing with voices that rang like silver bells, and he found himself pausing, lingering, feeling an unfamiliar ache within his spirit each time he witnessed such moments of quiet beauty. These sensations were new to him, warm, stirring, and profoundly dangerous. For watchers were not fashioned for earthly emotion. Their purpose was to observe, to guide, to remain above the currents that swept through mortal hearts. The laws that shaped them were clear. They were never to bond with humanity beyond the boundaries of instruction. They were never to allow mortal joys or sorrows to entwine with their own. They were never to forget the distance that heaven itself had decreed. But the distance was shrinking, day by day. Other watchers felt it as well. Sariel, whose voice once carried only the tone of wisdom, now found himself speaking softly with human elders, listening to their fears of storms and sickness. His celestial patience shifted into something more tender, more intimate. Barakiel, once stern as stone, observed human crafts with growing admiration, tracing his fingers along pottery etched with stories of harvests and hunts. Even Penemu, the silent one, lingered among the storytellers, his luminous eyes reflecting the flicker of firelight as he listened to tales of love, loss, and longing. The watchers had come to teach the mysteries of the heavens, yet instead they were learning the mysteries of the heart, and it troubled them. At night, they gathered upon the ridges overlooking the world. Their wings glowed faintly, casting long beams of radiance across the plains. No words were spoken at first. Silence reigned, a silence filled with unasked questions. Finally, Arakiel lifted his gaze toward the constellations, seeking steadiness in the familiar patterns of the sky. Yet even the stars felt more distant now, less like home and more like memory. "Do you feel it?" he asked quietly. The others did not reply, but their stillness was answer enough. Emotion was weaving itself through their being, threading earth into the very fiber of their celestial nature. The longer they remained, the stronger the pull became. What began as a gentle curiosity had grown into attachment, a bond that was reshaping their thoughts and desires. This troubled some of the watchers deeply. Others welcomed it with a warmth they could not admit aloud. But none could deny that a threshold had been crossed, even if they remained on its edge. Humanity, unaware of the silent turmoil unfolding within the hearts of their heavenly visitors, continued to embrace the watchers with reverence. They built small altars of gratitude near places where the watchers often appeared. They brought fruit, woven garlands, and carved stones as offerings, not worship, but honor. In return, the watchers bestowed knowledge: how to read the stars, how to recognize signs in the weather, how to preserve food for winter, how to treat wounds with herbs found deep in the forests. But these teachings were simple, restrained. The watchers knew the deeper mysteries, the ones that shaped the structure of creation, the ones forbidden to be shared. And yet, as their hearts softened toward humanity, the boundary of what they considered forbidden began to blur. The desire to protect mortals grew stronger. The desire to bless them grew stronger still. And with that desire came another, quieter emotion: loneliness. For the watchers had walked eternity among beings like themselves. Their existence had been full of purpose, but empty of intimacy. On earth, They witnessed families embracing, friends laughing, lovers whispering beneath the stars. These connections stirred something within them, awakening a longing they had never known. A longing for closeness, for companionship, for a bond that defied the cold clarity of celestial law. Arakiel felt it most profoundly. He found himself seeking the presence of certain humans, drawn to their gentle spirits and their capacity for trust. He lingered near a young woman who gathered water from the river each morning, moved by the quiet kindness in her eyes. He watched her laugh with her companions, and something in his heart trembled, something he feared, yet could not turn away from. This was the beginning, soft, fragile, almost unnoticeable, yet powerful enough to shake the foundations of heaven. For emotion, once awakened, cannot be unawakened, and desire, once born, begins to reshape destiny. The Watchers had descended. Now, the earth was changing them. As the seasons shifted, the Watchers' presence no longer felt like an otherworldly visitation, but an intimate thread woven quietly into the rhythm of human life. The people grew accustomed to their luminous forms along the horizon, to the gentle glow of wings glimpsed at dusk, to the soft resonance in the air whenever a Watcher passed nearby. Children approached them without fear, offering wildflowers or tiny carved figurines, and the Watchers received these gifts with a tenderness that would have astonished the heavenly hosts. Yet beneath this growing familiarity, destiny stirred with deeper currents. For the Watchers, the earth was no longer a realm to observe from a respectful distance. It had become a place of attachment, a place where the intensity of mortal life pulled at them with irresistibly human gravity. They found themselves drawn not only to humanity as a whole, but to individual souls, distinct hearts whose gentleness or resilience sparked emotions they had never been created to feel. Arakiel felt these emotions most profoundly. He walked among the people each day, learning their habits and listening to their laughter. But there was one presence that drew him more strongly than all the others. The young woman by the river, the one whose spirit seemed quiet yet steady, like the flow of the water she tended. Her name was Sarah. Sarah was not extraordinary in appearance. Her beauty was simple, unadorned, a soft smile at dawn, a gentle attentiveness to the needs of others, a courage that revealed itself in small acts rather than grand gestures. But something within her resonated with Arakiel in ways he could not understand. Her presence evoked a warmth he had no words for. Her voice, even in casual greeting, lingered within him long after she walked away, and her sorrow, felt only in fleeting shadows across her face, pierced him with a pain he had never known. He watched her from afar at first, keeping the respectful distance his mandate required. But each day, the distance grew harder to maintain. Sarah would lift her eyes toward him, curiosity shining in them, yet without fear. She sensed his gentleness, his restraint, his awe in the face of her simplicity. And though she did not fully grasp what he was, her heart recognized something in him, a stillness that comforted her in ways she could not explain. Other Watchers began to notice this shift within Arakiel and within themselves. Arakiel found himself lingering near a village artisan whose hands shaped clay with astonishing patience. Sariel listened to the prayers of a weary mother and felt tears rise, a human response he had never known. Even Penimue, the silent watcher of knowledge, began teaching a handful of curious youths how to record stories with symbols drawn in soft earth. The Watchers' bonds deepened, their emotions blossomed, and heaven, distant yet ever watchful, felt the tension building, like the tightening of a cosmic cord. One evening, as the sun slipped below the horizon and the river glowed with reflected fire, Arakiel walked to the place where Sarah often gathered water. He felt the weight of destiny with every step, as though each movement pressed more firmly against boundaries he was forbidden to cross. Yet, he could no longer deny the pull within him. He could no longer ignore the voice, quiet, persistent, that told him this path was already written in the deepest chambers of his being. Sarah turned when she sensed his presence, her eyes softening. The reflection of the watcher's radiance shimmered on the surface of the water, painting both of them in gold. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was not empty, but full of unspoken wonder, full of trembling curiosity, full of a fragile, yet undeniable connection. "Why do you come?" she asked quietly, her voice carried by the breath of the river. Arakiel hesitated, searching for words in a language that had never required expression of desire. Finally, with the gentleness of a dawn breaking, he replied, "Because the earth has taught me something I did not know I could feel." Sarah's breath caught. Though she did not understand the celestial weight behind his confession, she merely saw a being of light, looking at her not as a mortal, but as something cherished, but unseen to both of them. The consequences of this moment rippled outward, like waves, across the fabric of creation. High above, beyond the fold of the sky, the heavenly realm stirred. What had begun as a shift within the watchers' hearts was now a fracture, small, quiet, but growing. The bond between heaven and earth trembled. A divine order, once unbroken, felt the first strain of rebellion, not yet named. For love, once awakened in forbidden places, becomes a force capable of reshaping worlds. And soon, this love, tender, dangerous, unstoppable, would give birth to something the earth had never known. The giants were coming. The days that followed Arakiel's quiet confession unfolded with a strange, breathless anticipation, as though the world itself understood that a boundary had been crossed. The Watchers continued to walk among humanity, their every gesture filled with a tenderness that grew more pronounced with each passing dawn. Yet beneath that softness lay an undercurrent of change, a gathering momentum that none could fully name, but all could feel. Humanity sensed it in their dreams first. Night after night, men and women awoke trembling, whispering of visions unlike any they had known before. They dreamed of towering figures whose shadows stretched across the valleys, whose footsteps shook the earth like distant thunder. They dreamed of voices deep, resonant, echoing with ancient authority, calling them not in words, but in instincts, stirring something dormant within their spirits. Some dreamed of light breaking through the mountains. Others dreamed of darkness, clothed in radiance. But all felt an undeniable truth threading through their visions. Something immense was approaching. The Watchers felt it, too, though differently. It stirred not from dream, but from within a resonance that began to echo in the deepest parts of their essence. The bonds they had formed, forbidden yet irresistible, were weaving new threads into the tapestry of creation. Threads neither heaven nor earth had anticipated. Threads that carried consequences beyond the understanding of either realm. Arakiel felt this most profoundly, though he tried to conceal it from the others. His connection to Sarah had deepened into something neither could deny. When they spoke, even briefly, he felt the weight of worlds pressing upon his chest, as though destiny itself bent closer, watching, waiting, and yet he could not turn away. Love, soft, fragile, and infinitely dangerous, had already taken root. One evening, as twilight's violet hues stretched across the sky, Sarah stood by the river once more, her hands trailing through the water, as if smoothing restless thoughts. She sensed Arakiel before she saw him, just as she always did now. His presence had become familiar, comforting, like a warm glow in a cold room. When he stepped beside her, the surface of the water shimmered faintly with reflected light. "You feel it too, don't you?" Sarah whispered, her eyes following the ripples. "The change." Arakiel lowered his gaze. "Yes," he said, his voice quiet, heavy with truths he dared not speak. The world is shifting. She turned toward him, studying the solemn glow in his features. Is it because of you? She asked softly. Because of the Watchers? He hesitated long enough for Sarah's breath to slow. The Watchers and the choices we have made, he replied, though the words felt insufficient, too small to encompass the enormity of what was unfolding. But Sarah asked nothing more. Perhaps she sensed that the answer lay not in explanation but in the silence that passed between them, silence that trembled with unspoken destiny. In other parts of the world, similar bonds had formed. Watchers who had once stood aloof now found themselves drawn into the intimate rhythms of mortal existence, moments of laughter shared beside a fire, hands brushing when passing tools, quiet companionship during nights when the wind seemed to speak. Some Watchers resisted these feelings, retreating into solitude upon the high ridges. Others embraced them openly, standing beside humanity with a devotion that transcended duty. But wherever these bonds deepened, the same strange phenomenon occurred. A quiet swelling of energy within the Watcher's being, like a chord tightening before a crescendo. It stirred their senses. It altered their thoughts. It changed the very structure of their celestial resonance. And soon, the signs became impossible to ignore. Human women, blessed with these forbidden unions, began to experience strange and mysterious shifts within their bodies. Strength beyond natural strength, endurance beyond known limits, dreams that carried visions of vast landscapes and distant storms. Life within them began to surge with intensity, growing too rapidly for ordinary flesh, yet filling them with a vitality that seemed almost divine. Whispers traveled from tribe to tribe, whispers of women whose steps shook the ground, whose eyes gleamed with an inner fire, whose children moved within them with a force that frightened and awed all who witnessed it. Some elders claimed these children were blessings, gifted by the heavens. Others believed they heralded disaster. The Watchers knew the truth, though most refused to speak it aloud. These children were not like other children. They carried the blood of heaven and the breath of earth. They carried the strength of celestial purpose and the fire of human passion. They were the first of a new lineage, born from a union forbidden since the dawn of creation. They were the Nephilim, and when the first of them opened his eyes to the world, the earth itself seemed to recoil and rejoice in the same breath. He was immense from the moment of birth, vast, heavy, powerful, his cry echoing across the hills like the roar of a storm. His mother, though weakened, looked upon him with awe rather than fear, for even in that monumental form, he bore a strange beauty, a radiance that spoke of both earth and heaven. Across the land, more children followed. Each birth was accompanied by wonders or signs, winds that shifted without cause, lights that shimmered across the sky, tremors deep in the ground that felt like the heartbeat of the ancient world awakening. Humanity watched with trembling hearts, unsure whether to celebrate or mourn the arrival of these colossal children. The Watchers watched with a mixture of awe and dread, knowing that something irreversible had begun. For the Nephilim were not merely children of two realms. They were the beginning of a destiny that would one day shake the foundations of creation itself. As the first Nephilim children grew, the world shifted around them, not gradually, but with the force of a new age pressing through the seams of the old. They did not mature like ordinary infants. Their bodies strengthened with astonishing speed, their limbs lengthening with each passing moon, their senses sharpening beyond the reach of human perception. By the time a Nephilim child could walk, he stood taller than a grown man. By the time he could speak, his voice rippled through the air, with a resonance that stirred both awe and unease. The tribes watched them with conflicted hearts. These children were beautiful in ways that defied human understanding, faces sculpted with celestial symmetry, eyes glowing with faint, shifting hues like embers dancing beneath water. Yet their beauty was matched by power, a raw physical force that challenged the fragile balance of the world. Their footsteps cracked stones, their breath steamed in cold air even when no frost was present. Their cries could send flocks scattering across the sky. Still, there was innocence in them at first, a childlike curiosity, a tenderness that revealed their mortal half. They smiled easily. They reached for the hands of those they trusted. They stared with wonder at the flight of birds or the shifting glimmer of sunlight on the water. In their earliest years, they sought affection, guidance, comfort, the gentle anchors of human childhood. But alongside this innocence grew something deeper, something that neither realm had prepared for, a hunger. A restless energy pulsed through their bones, urging them toward challenge, toward mastery, toward the testing of their own strength. They lifted boulders as if they were toys. They ran across plains swiftly enough to startle the wind. They wrestled with wild beasts, not out of malice, but instinct, as though their very existence demanded expression of their colossal nature. Arakiel witnessed this with a quiet, tightening grief. Sarah's son, whom she named Armin, was among the firstborn of the Nephilim. He grew into a towering boy, with an innocence that shone through his enormity. He adored his mother, often lowering his head to her level just to hear her whisper songs into his ear, songs that she had once sung beside the river. Arakiel watched these moments from the shadows of the grove, his heart filled with a tenderness so fierce it felt almost like pain. Yet even in Armin's gentleness, Arakiel saw the unmistakable signs of destiny taking a dangerous shape. When the child laughed, the birds took flight, as if startled by thunder. When he ran, the ground trembled beneath him. When he grew upset, frustrated by emotions he could not yet control, the very trees shuddered with the force of it. Sarah would soothe him, pressing her hands to his massive cheeks, murmuring words that calmed the tempest within. But Arakiel knew such storms would only grow, and they did. Across the land, the Nephilim children began to test the boundaries of their world. They competed with one another in games that quickly escalated beyond games, contests of strength, leaps that covered ravines, races that spanned miles. Their laughter boomed across valleys, echoes shaking the leaves from branches. The humans who watched them felt torn between awe and fear. These beings, born of women they knew and celestial beings they revered, were both kin and strangers, both miracles and omens. The watchers, too, found themselves divided. Some gazed upon the Nephilim with pride, believing them to be a new revelation of creation's potential. Others saw, in their growing might, the seeds of catastrophe. A few retreated from the tribes altogether, troubled by the consequences of their disobedience. As celestial beings, they understood what humans could not. Nothing born outside divine order could remain harmless for long. Most troubling of all was the way the Nephilim looked at the world. Their eyes, bright and shifting like molten gold, held curiosity but also a dawning sense of dominion. They did not merely see the mountains, they felt called to surpass them. They did not simply observe the creatures of the forests. They instinctively sought mastery over them. A strange fire stirred within their hearts, an ambition that grew alongside their bodies. And then came the first moment that changed everything. It happened on a quiet afternoon near a village where several Nephilim children played. One of them, a boy named Gilor, whose father was the watcher Barakiel, challenged a wild bull that had wandered into the clearing. The bull lowered its horns, pawing the earth, snorting clouds of steam. The tribespeople shouted for the child to move away. But Gilor did not move. He smiled. When the bull charged, Gilor met it head-on. The impact cracked like a breaking tree. The bull fell, lifeless. Its neck snapped beneath the force of the child's strength. Silence spread across the clearing. Gilor stood over the fallen creature, breathing hard, not with fear but exhilaration. His eyes gleamed with a fierce spark triumph, awakened for the first time. The humans stepped back. The watchers lowered their faces, troubled, and Gilor, sensing their unease, looked around with confusion, unable to understand why the act felt so natural, so easy, so exhilarating. It was the first sign the moment innocence began to yield to something far greater and far more dangerous. For the Nephilim were no longer merely children of prophecy. They were beings discovering the magnitude of their own strength. And once power awakens, it seeks direction, whether toward protection or toward dominion. As the Nephilim continued to grow, the world shifted again, this time with unmistakable gravity, as though creation itself sensed a force rising that could not be contained. Their steps grew heavier, their voices deeper, their ambitions sharper. Childhood innocence faded, replaced by the first flickers of pride, restlessness, and an awareness of their own extraordinary nature. They were no longer content with simple games of strength. They sought meaning for their power purpose, for the might that surged through their enormous frames. The tribes could feel this transformation long before the Watchers admitted it. When a Nephilim entered a village, conversations softened, then ceased. Mothers drew children close, though they tried to hide their fear. Hunters bowed their heads, humbled before young giants who towered above them like living mountains. And though the Nephilim still loved their human kin, still returned to the arms of the mothers who bore them, a quiet distance began to grow. An invisible chasm formed not from rejection, but from sheer scale. The Nephilim no longer belonged fully to the world of mortals, nor did they belong to heaven. Arakiel felt this deeply as he watched Sarah's son, Armin, climb the hills with strides that covered ground in moments. The boy's laughter echoed across the plains with a resonance that shook dust from the branches. Yet beneath that joy, Arakiel sensed another current, an unspoken yearning, a searching gaze that lingered not on the familiar, but on the distant horizon. Amon was beginning to realize that the world around him was small, fragile, easily shaped by his will. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in rose and violet, Amon stood by the river where his mother once carried him, though he now dwarfed the very trees around him. Arakiel approached quietly, watching the boy's reflection ripple across the water. "You're troubled," Arakiel said softly, though he already understood. Amon didn't turn. "I feel pulled," he murmured, "like something inside me is waking up, calling me somewhere I've never been." He paused, dipping his hand into the river. The water swirled violently around his massive arm. "I don't know who I am." Arakiel felt a shard of sorrow pierce his being. For how could he explain to this half-celestial child that he was the result of a union never meant to exist, shaped by forces that defied the harmony of creation? How could he tell him that the very strength stirring within him was a sign of a coming reckoning? Before he could answer, Amon turned with eyes glowing faintly like smoldering amber. "Am I meant to protect the world?" he asked. "Or am I meant to rule it?" Arakiel's silence was answer enough. Across the land, other Nephilim were asking the same unspoken questions. Gilor, the bull slayer, began leading small bands of children into the forests to challenge the largest beasts they could find. A girl named Elisa, born of Penamu's forbidden union, lifted fallen trees with a single hand, reshaping riverbanks to suit her curiosity. Another, Samyaza's son, was already crafting weapons of stone too heavy for any mortal man to lift. Each act of strength rippled through creation like a whisper of coming upheaval, and the Watchers, once serene guardians, now held nightly gatherings in secret, their luminous forms dimmed by unease. Some argued that the Nephilim must be guided, shaped, taught restraint before their powers spiraled beyond control. Others feared that guidance was no longer possible, that the children's very nature carried a prophecy of destruction written into their being. "We have broken the boundary," Sariel said, his voice trembling for the first time since descending to earth. "And the world will break because of us." But Arakiel, though burdened, remained silent. He thought of Sarah, of Armin's gaze, searching for destiny, in a world too small to contain him. He knew the truth none dared speak. Love had sown the seeds of catastrophe, yet love still pulsed through every consequence. Could he condemn the very beings that embodied both heaven's radiance and humanity's fragile hope? The watchers scattered after their uneasy counsel, each carrying the weight of decisions still unmade. But as they vanished into the night, they could not sense the shifting tremor deep within the earth, the awakening of something older, something instinctive, something responding to the unnatural presence of the Nephilim. Nature had tolerated their birth. It would not tolerate their ascendancy. Storms began to coil along the edges of the horizon, forming patterns that twisted like serpents. Oceans moaned beneath unseen pressure. The winds pulled in strange directions, whispering warnings to anyone who dared listen. Even the animals fled toward the heartlands, sensing the imbalance with primal clarity. And the Nephilim, taller by the day, stronger with each breath, felt the surge of energy within them rising, urging them toward acts that would echo across the ages. The ancient world trembled, for the giants were awakening to themselves. And soon the earth would feel the full weight of their destiny. The rise of the Nephilim did not unfold with thunder or fanfare. It spread quietly at first, like the slow swell of a tide that no one notices until the waves begin to swallow the shore. Their growth, physical, emotional, and spiritual, pressed outward into the world with a force both mesmerizing and unsettling. By the time they reached adolescence, they towered above the tallest humans, their shadows stretching across the plains like encroaching mountains. The earth felt smaller around them, as though struggling to contain their colossal presence. Humanity lived in their lengthening shadows, with mingled awe and apprehension. Villages that once bustled with simple joy now pulsed with a cautious rhythm. For the Nephilim were no longer children seeking comfort or games. Their voices had deepened into rolling tones that vibrated in one's chest. Their hands, capable of tenderness, were now also capable of shaping the world with terrifying ease. And their eyes, once filled with the curiosity of youth, now gleamed with an awareness of power that stirred unease even in those who loved them most. It began with small acts. A Nephilim boy, frustrated by a disagreement, split a boulder in two with a careless strike. Another, irritated by a predator lurking near the livestock, hurled the beast across a ravine with a single sweep of his arm. A girl, tall as a tree and twice as strong, waded into a river during a flood and diverted its path simply by pressing her feet into the soil. To the Nephilim, these were instinctive gestures. To humanity, they were revelations and warnings. Yet admiration clung to fear, unwilling to release its grip. Many humans revered the Nephilim as protectors, believing their strength to be heaven's gift in times of danger. They sought counsel from them, offered gifts, even asked for judgments in disputes too difficult for elders to resolve. The giants responded with varying degrees of patience and pride. Some embraced the trust placed in them, others felt entitled to it. Still, others found themselves intoxicated by the reverent gazes, the whispered praises, the dependence that grew around their presence. Dominion began not with conquest, but with expectation. Armon, Sarah's son, stood at the center of this shaping age. Now grown to a height that made even the tallest watcher seem small, he walked with a quiet gravity that commanded attention. His strength was unmatched, yet he wielded it with restraint born from his mother's influence and Arakiel's guidance. Still, an internal storm lingered within him, a knowledge that he was neither wholly human nor wholly divine. Suspended between worlds that seemed increasingly too narrow to define him, he wandered often through the highlands, searching for solitude. The earth trembled beneath his steps, though he tried to tread lightly. The wind wrapped around him as if greeting a long-awaited king. Animals followed him at a cautious distance, drawn by instinct, uncertain whether to flee or revere. And through it all, Armin sensed a vast emptiness, stretching before him the hollow echo of destiny, calling his name. One evening, as crimson spilled across the sky like a curtain of fire, Armin encountered Gilor and several other giants gathered near the ruins of an old hunting lodge. They were speaking in low, excited voices, their massive bodies forming a ring around a stone throne they had carved from the mountain with their bare hands. Gilor sat upon it, his posture relaxed, his expression steeped in newfound authority. "We are stronger than the world beneath us," Gilor declared, eyes glinting with fierce ambition. "Why should we bow to the ways of men? Why should we pretend to be small when the heavens themselves have placed greatness in our bones?" Some giants nodded eagerly. Others hesitated, their youthful faces torn between pride and uncertainty. Armin approached, the stone beneath him cracking under the weight of his footsteps. "Strength does not make us rulers," he said quietly. "It makes us responsible." Gilor laughed, a booming, echoing sound that scattered birds into the sky. "Responsible for what? For the fragile beings who tremble at our shadows, for the watchers who created us and now hide from their own actions. No, Armin, we were born to rise. We were born to lead." Armin's jaw tightened, but he did not raise his voice. "Power without restraint becomes destruction, and restraint," Gilor countered, leaning forward, "is the cage of the weak." A murmur swept through the young giants, their massive forms shifting with unease and excitement. The air grew heavy, thick with tension. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, sensing the fracture forming between two paths, one of dominion, the other of discipline. Armin stepped closer. His presence alone dimmed Gilor's smile. "If we become tyrants," Armin said, "we will bring ruin to those we love and to ourselves." Gilor's eyes narrowed. "Perhaps ruin is only the name the fearful give to change." The giants fell silent, and in that stillness, the ancient world seemed to lean closer, listening. It was a moment that marked the beginning of a divide, one that would grow until it could no longer be bridged. For in the hearts of the Nephilim, two destinies had awakened: the desire to protect and the desire to rule. Only one of them could shape the age to come. The tension between the Nephilim clans, sharpened with each passing season, widening into a rift that neither humanity nor the Watchers could mend. What began as philosophical difference soon hardened into identity. Some giants aligned themselves with Armin, who moved with quiet dignity, ever cautious of the power coursing through his colossal body. Others gathered around Gilor, whose fierce charisma ignited the ambitions of many. And between these growing factions, the earth trembled beneath the weight of choices taking shape in shadows. Humanity felt the shift long before the giants fully understood it. The tribes sensed the subtle difference in the air. When Armin approached, calm settled like dew upon the grass. When Gilor or his followers passed, the wind seemed to recoil, swirling unpredictably around their steps. Children who once played fearlessly near the giants now hid behind their mothers, struck silent by the unease that radiated from Gilor's camp. Animals avoided the highlands where Gilor's clan gathered, their instincts warning them of a looming imbalance. The Watchers struggled most of all. Arakiel watched from the ridges with a heart heavy as stone. He had known that the Nephilim would grow mighty, but he had not foreseen how swiftly pride would take root in their celestial lineage. And yet, even as he grieved the path Gilor carved, he could not deny that a similar fire smoldered within all the giants, including Armin. Power was awakening inside them as naturally as breath. It was their nature, a nature not forged by heaven nor shaped by earth, but born in defiance of both. One night, under a sky tangled with stars, Sariel confronted Arakiel in a deserted valley. "This is our doing," Sariel said, his wings dim beneath the moonlight. "We have shaped a generation that will outgrow its boundaries. Their strength already surpasses ours. Soon, no being on earth will be able to challenge them." Arakiel turned, grief etched across his radiant features. "And what would you have us do? Destroy what we brought into being? Undo the children born from love we should never have felt?" Sariel's silence revealed the truth. No answer could absolve them. Meanwhile, the Nephilim's actions grew bolder. Gilor led expeditions into the wilderness, returning with tales of subduing beasts that once terrorized entire regions. His followers built stone circles and towering markers of their strength, symbols carved not with beauty but with dominance. They began training in combat, not for defense, but for the exhilaration that surged through their veins when their mighty blows split trees or sent echoes rolling across the valleys. Armin watched these changes with a growing heaviness, for part of him understood the thrill Gilor's camp indulged in. The same hunger stirred within him, an ache to challenge the world, to scale mountains, to test the limits of his strength. Yet when he looked upon Sarah, when he felt the warmth of her hand pressed against the enormity of his own, the fire inside him softened. She grounded him. She reminded him of humility, of gentleness, of what power should protect rather than exploit. One afternoon, while Armin walked beside the hills overlooking his mother's village, he found Gilor waiting for him. The wind was strangely still, as if wary of the conversation forming between them. "You waste your strength," Gilor said without preamble. His massive arms crossed over his chest, muscles rippling beneath bronze skin. "You walk among mortals as though you are one of them. You bow your head to their weaknesses." "Why?" Armin remained standing, his gaze steady. "Because strength isn't freedom if it destroys what it touches." Gilor smiled, a slow, dangerous smile. "You speak like a watcher, and you," Armin answered, "speak like something that the world may come to fear." Gilor stepped closer, towering even over Armin. "Fear," he said, voice low and thrumming with power, "is respect that has not yet learned my name." Armin felt the earth crack beneath their feet from the tension between them. The air thickened, sparks of celestial energy pulsing faintly between their towering forms. For a heartbeat, it seemed the two might clash, giant against giant, destiny against destiny. But Armin turned away, refusing the battle. Gilor's laughter followed him, echoing like distant thunder. "One day," he called out, "you will have to choose whether you are a shepherd or a king." The wind finally moved again, carrying Gilor's words across the plain like a warning etched into the breath of the world. And though Armin walked away, a storm gathered behind his eyes, a storm he no longer knew how long he could hold back, for even within him, the fire of the Nephilim was rising. As seasons turned, and the young world shifted beneath the weight of its monumental suns, the divide among the Nephilim widened until it stretched like a fault line across the earth itself. Armin carried his restraint as a burden, clinging to the gentleness taught by Sira and shaped by Arakiel. Yet with each passing day, the fire inside him, the fire shared by all giants, glowed brighter, hotter, hungrier. He felt it humming in his bones when storms gathered on the horizon. He felt it thrumming through the soil when Gilor's clan trained in violent displays. He felt it twisting through the air each time he walked past the awe-filled eyes of the mortals who depended on him. For the giants were no longer children. They were becoming symbols of hope for some, of terror for others. Their every action changed the rhythm of the world. One evening, as dusk draped the plains in molten gold, Sarah approached Armin, where he sat upon a stone, outcropping, overlooking the valley. He dwarfed the cliff beneath him, the rock groaning faintly under his tremendous weight. She placed a hand upon his ankle, her touch a mere whisper against the colossus her son had become. "You carry the sky in your eyes again," she said softly, tilting her head to study his brooding expression. "Tell me what troubles you." Armin looked down at her, small, fragile, and yet stronger in spirit than any giant he had ever known. "Mother," he murmured, "I feel torn in two. There is a force inside me, something that wants to rise, to shape the world, to challenge anything that stands in my path. And yet, when I look at you, or when I think of the people who fear even the tremor of my footsteps, I want to shield them, not tower over them." Sarah's fingers tightened on his skin. "Strength does not corrupt a good heart," she whispered. "But the world may try to teach you otherwise." Armin bowed his head, the weight of destiny pressing heavy across his massive shoulders. "And Gilor says, I was born to rule." Sarah hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of wisdom. "Rule, perhaps. Protect, yes. But to rule without love is to forget why you were given breath." She touched his hand, her palm barely spanning the width of one of his fingers. "Whatever you become, let compassion be the root." Her words soothed him, but only for a moment. For far in the distance, across the hills and through the gathering shadows of twilight, a low rumble rose, a sound like the cracking of mountains. Gilor's clan was at work again. Armin stood, the ground shaking beneath him as he stepped forward. Sarah watched him go, her heart heavy with a fear she dared not name, the fear that the world was pulling her son into a destiny even she could not soften. Across the highlands, Gilor's followers had begun shaping something unprecedented. With their colossal hands, they erected massive stone walls, dragging boulders the size of houses into towering structures that stretched toward the sky. They carved symbols into the rock spirals of dominance, jagged lines that imitated lightning, marks that declared territory. It was no mere training ground. It was the first fortress of the Nephilim. When Armin arrived, the giants paused their labor, turning toward him with a mixture of respect and challenge. Gilor stood at the center, arms crossed, a confident smirk playing across his face. "Impressive, isn't it?" Gilor gestured to the massive walls rising behind him. "A kingdom worthy of our kind." Armin's voice rumbled through the clearing. "A kingdom built on pride will crumble." Gilor laughed. "Not ours. We are born of heaven and earth. We are the new order." Armin stepped closer, his towering form casting a long shadow across the stone foundations. "You carve walls where there should be bridges," he said. "You seek to raise yourselves above those who fear you. That is not greatness." Gilor's smile tightened. "You speak of humility. But humility is a chain, Armin. Look around. The humans tremble at our presence. They speak our names in awe. This world bends for us. Why should we bend to it?" The giants behind him murmured agreement, their voices thrumming like a gathering storm. Armin breathed deeply, fighting the fire rising in his chest. Because power without mercy destroys everything it touches, including those who wield it. Gilor's eyes flashed, sharp as obsidian. Maybe destruction is necessary. Maybe the world must be broken to be rebuilt. The air thickened, charged with tension, with unspoken prophecy, with the faint crackle of power awakening between two colossal destinies. Even the clouds above seemed to gather in anticipation, swirling into dark, coiling forms. Armin stepped forward until he and Gilor stood face to face, two mountains of living flesh and celestial fire. The clearing fell silent. No bird sang, no wind stirred. "You cannot build a kingdom on conquest," Armin said. Gilor leaned closer, voice low as distant thunder. "Then watch as I prove that I can." The words struck the air with finality. A line had been drawn, a future had shifted, and though no blow was struck, the ancient world knew. War had begun not yet in violence, but in ambition. A war that would one day shake the foundations of the earth. The world darkened slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, as though the very fabric of creation hesitated to reveal the shadow gathering beneath its surface. The Nephilim had risen tall as cedars, strong as storm winds, and with their ascent came a shift in the hearts of the Watchers. Those once radiant beings, appointed as guardians of humankind, now walked the earth carrying burdens they could no longer conceal. Their celestial composure thinned beneath the weight of choices made in longing, in compassion, in disobedience. Heaven's light still clung to them, but it dimmed day by day, veiled by the growing turmoil within. For the Watchers, corruption did not arrive abruptly. It seeped in gently, like a slow poison, stirring the waters of their souls. Their descent had begun in devotion, love for humanity's fragility, admiration for its resilience. But that devotion had twisted into attachment, and attachment into desire. Now, with the creation of the Nephilim towering before them, the Watchers felt the consequences of their longing take root. Arakiel felt it more keenly than the rest. Once a being of perfect purpose, he now wandered the high places with steps that faltered beneath the heaviness in his heart. When he looked upon Sarah, the woman he had loved beyond the boundaries of heaven, he saw not a mistake, but a wound in the order of creation, one he had willingly carved. And when he looked upon Armin, the gentle giant who bore his radiance in mortal form, he felt both pride and grief intertwined like twin branches from the same ancient root. But the corruption spreading through the Watchers was not only emotional, it stirred their powers as well. Visions once bright and clear, now flickered with discordant shadows. Their senses, once attuned to the harmony of creation, now pulsed with conflicting currents. And more dangerously, knowledge forbidden to mortals began to slip from their lips. At first, it happened unintentionally. A Watcher, revealing how to read signs in the stars, how to shape metal from ore, how to speak names of spirits hidden in the deep places. But as time pressed forward, these teachings grew deliberate. The Watchers, yearning to ease their guilt or strengthen their bonds with humanity, offered wisdom that was never meant to be shared. In the Heartlands, Sariel taught a small tribe how to forge tools harder than stone, believing it would protect them from beasts. He did not realize that, in time, those tools would become weapons. Penemu, driven by a strange tenderness toward the curious minds who followed him, taught rudimentary scripts, symbols that captured speech and memory. It seemed harmless, a gift. But from these symbols, humanity began to question truths once accepted in reverence. Knowledge awakened, something restless in their hearts. And worst of all, Watchers like Azazel, once stern and disciplined, found themselves intoxicated by the feeling of being needed, admired, revered. He taught men the crafting of blades and armor, the shaping of fire, the mixing of pigments to draw symbols of power. He believed he was elevating them. In truth, he was leading them into danger, calling forth appetites that had slept peacefully since the dawn. The earth felt the shift. Storms began forming in strange, unnatural arcs along the horizon, as though the sky itself recoiled from the mingling of forbidden knowledge and burgeoning pride. Animals grew restless, their migrations breaking patterns older than memory. Even the rivers changed temper, flooding in seasons where they once lay dormant, and humanity caught between awe and fear began to grow different. With new tools came ambition. With new symbols came questioning. With new weapons came conflict. Tribes that had once survived through cooperation now warred over land, over resources, over the power bestowed upon them by their celestial teachers. Fires burned in the night where once there had been peace. And the Watchers, the very beings meant to preserve harmony, found themselves the catalysts of chaos. Arakiel watched this with a hollow ache expanding inside him. He saw men sharpen blades taught by Azazel's hand. He saw women paint symbols of protection whispered by spirits they could not comprehend. He saw children playing with tools that glimmered with deadly potential. And deep within, he felt the truth pressing cold against his heart. The corruption had begun with the Watchers, but it was spreading through the world like wildfire. One day, Arakiel stood upon a cliff overlooking a valley where two tribes clashed. Sparks of metal flashing beneath the sunday, the sight pierced him as if the cries rising from the earth struck against the remnants of heaven still clinging to his being. He fell to his knees, the light around him flickering as grief racked his spirit. He whispered a question into the wind, knowing no one could answer. "What have we done?" The wind did not respond, but the earth trembled beneath him as though echoing the sorrow of a being who had once carried the brilliance of the stars. Far away, Gilor and his clan watched the turmoil with approval. Conflict was fuel for their ambition. They saw a world weakening under the weight of celestial mistakes and a world ripe for dominion. And in the shadows of the mountains, other watchers, those whose corruption ran deepest, began to whisper among themselves. If the heavens no longer guided them, why should they remain bound by its laws? Why not build a new order, one shaped by their desires rather than divine decree? Thus the corruption deepened, not merely in deed but in thought. And above it all, the heavens grew quiet, not from ignorance, but from grief. For the rebellion had begun, not with war, but with longing. The corruption unfolding among the Watchers did not remain hidden for long. It spread like an unseen mist, drifting between mountains and valleys, seeping into the rhythm of daily life. Human eyes could not perceive the spiritual fractures widening in the heavens, but they felt the consequences in subtle shifts, dreams darkening with strange visions, tempers flaring without cause, an inexplicable heaviness settling over the land. It was as though the harmony that once bound creation together had begun to unravel, thread by fragile thread. The Watchers changed in ways they scarcely understood. Their radiance dimmed, not extinguished, but clouded, as though veiled by shadows of their own making. Their voices, once steady as the flow of time, now trembled with contradictions. Wisdom, once pure, bright, unmarred, became tangled with emotion, clouded by desire, warped by the intoxicating touch of human admiration. They walked the earth more boldly now, straying far from the limits that once anchored them in obedience. Azazel, once revered for his disciplined mind, now moved through camps and villages with the confidence of one who believed himself indispensable. Men gathered around him eagerly, entranced by the promise of mastery he offered. He taught them to work metal with fire, shaping not only tools but weapons of unmatched lethality. Blades that gleamed like starlight, shields as strong as stone. He convinced himself he did it for their protection, yet beneath the surface, pride blossomed. Pride that humanity looked to him instead of the heavens. Pride that he could shape their destiny. Strength, he would say, flames dancing across his palms, is not a gift to fear. It is a power to command. His words spread swiftly. Men repeated them as though they carried divine authority, because in their eyes, he was divine. Other Watchers followed his path. Penamue, gentle yet restless, found solace in sharing secrets meant for heaven alone. He taught the mysteries of herbs, the art of writing, the subtle craft of persuasion through symbols and marks. These teachings awakened new possibilities in the human mind, but with knowledge came seduction. With language came the shaping of thought. With thought came the birth of ambition. Humanity's innocence began to erode, replaced by an expansive awareness of power, territory, desire. Soon, entire tribes grew dependent upon Watchers for guidance. Rivalries formed between those touched by different teachers. Tribes blessed with weapon forging challenged those who possessed only stone. Tribes gifted with written symbols sought to record their histories and justify their dominance. The Watchers observed these conflicts with concern, yet they did not withdraw. Their presence magnified the very tensions they wished to quell. Sariel, who once walked with the air of a sage, now bore a softened discipline. He too had succumbed, not through arrogance but through compassion. He revealed secrets of healing and weather, fearing for humanity's survival as storms grew more erratic. But even his kindness carried unintended consequences. Some tribes saw his teachings as a sign of divine favor and began to set themselves above others, claiming spiritual superiority. Little by little, fragmentation seeped through humanity like cracks in old clay. And all the while, the Nephilim watched. From their towering heights, they observed how human wars, small at first, began to ripple outward. Tribes clashed over land enriched by forbidden knowledge. Steel struck steel for the first time in the history of the world. Fires burned where once the night had held only quiet. Blood-stained tools that had been intended for harvest and craft. The giants felt stirrings within their colossal frames, emotions magnified by their mixed nature. Some, like Armin, recoiled at the senseless violence, their hearts heavy with sorrow they could not express. Others, like Gilor, watched with excitement burning in their luminous eyes. Conflict resonated with something primal inside them, a calling toward dominance, conquest, the shaping of the world by force. To them, the Watchers' corruption was not tragedy. It was opportunity. If the Guardians fall, Gilor proclaimed to his growing circle of followers, then the world must choose new guardians, new leaders, new rulers. He spoke these words beneath storm clouds that churned in unnatural patterns, winds circling him like loyal spirits. The giants who surrounded him listened with rapt attention, their breaths thick with expectation. The earth trembles because it awaits its kings, he continued, his voice rising like thunder. And we children of heaven and flesh are those kings. Armon, who stood among them only because he wished to understand, felt those words strike his heart like a blow. He stepped forward, towering even over many of the giants present. Dominion built on arrogance will crumble, he said quietly. Gilor smirked. And dominion built on humility will be taken. The giants roared in approval, their voices vibrating the ground beneath them. Armin's chest tightened. He felt the rift widening again, this time not between Watchers, but between the giants themselves. And far above, in the unseen reaches of the heavens, something stirred. The divine realm had grown silent. But silence is not absence. It is judgment, gathering strength. The corruption of the Watchers had reached its breaking point. The earth was calling out, and heaven was preparing its answer. The silence from the heavens deepened into something heavy, something palpable, something that settled upon creation like the chill before a storm. It was not the silence of indifference, nor the silence of distant realms, too far away to witness unfolding ruin. It was the silence of withheld judgment, the kind that made mountains tremble and oceans shift restlessly in their vast beds. Though the Watchers tried to ignore it, though the Nephilim dismissed it, though humanity could not name it, all felt the weight of that silence pressing upon the world. It began to manifest in subtle ways. The skies darkened earlier than before, their colors bleeding into bruised purples and tarnished golds. Winds grew unpredictable, swirling in restless circles as if unsure of their path. Rivers rose without rainfall, carrying silt that glimmered faintly like crushed gemstones. Even the stars seemed to pulse irregularly, dimming at moments when Watchers gathered or when giants tested their strength upon the hills. Nature sensed the fracture long before its inhabitants understood it. Armin felt it most vividly. Whenever he walked across the plains, he could feel the earth shifting beneath him, not merely under the weight of his colossal frame, but as though the soil itself recoiled from the unnatural mingling of realms. Trees seemed to whisper in warning as he passed. Birds scattered from the branches before he approached. Even the wind brushed against his skin with a strange tension, as though trying to push him back toward a destiny he had not yet chosen. He found solace only near his mother, Sarah, whose gentle presence grounded him, reminding him that he still possessed a heart capable of love rather than conquest. But even she began to sense the change. One evening, as the horizon smoldered with streaks of orange and crimson, Sarah found Armand standing on a cliff overlooking the valley. His massive form was turned away from her, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed upon a village where two tribes clashed in the distance, spears glinting, fires rising, steel ringing against stone. "It grows worse," Sarah whispered, stepping closer. Armand did not turn. "Because we have changed the world," he murmured, voice heavy with a grief too vast to contain. "We were not meant to exist, and now everything breaks." Sarah reached out, touching his hand, a gesture that seemed impossibly small against the enormity of his body. "You exist because I loved," she said quietly, "and because the heavens allowed longing to bloom where perhaps it should not have. But existence alone is not evil, my son. What you choose, what you become, that is where destiny is shaped." Armand lowered his gaze, torn between the tenderness her words stirred and the fire of his giant's nature rising within him. "And Gilor chooses a path of dominion. Then you must choose differently," she whispered. But Armand was not certain he could, for with every passing day his strength grew. His senses sharpened, his awareness expanded. He felt the pulse of storms before they formed, the ache of the mountains before they cracked, the breath of the world shifting in anticipation of something colossal. Power flowed through him like a river with no end, and the greater it grew, the harder it became to hold it back. Elsewhere, the watchers gathered in a secluded ravine, their luminous forms flickering unsteadily. They sensed heaven's silence. They sensed judgment brewing. Azazel paced like a caged storm, his once radiant aura now shadowed by defiance. "If heaven disapproves," he snarled, "then let heaven speak. Why hide behind silence? Why watch and do nothing?" Sariel bowed his head. "Judgment does not arrive with the noise of men. It comes quietly, and then suddenly." Penemu shivered, as though chilled by a wind only he could feel. "We have done what cannot be undone, and the world cries out beneath the weight of it." Arakiel, the only one who had not spoken, finally raised his gaze. His once brilliant eyes were clouded with sorrow. "We tried to guide humanity," he whispered. "We tried to love them. But love without obedience becomes selfishness. And selfishness," he looked toward the horizon where fires burned, "become destruction." A tremor rippled through the earth, subtle but unmistakable. The watchers fell silent. Far above, beyond the veil of the sky, a faint rumble moved across the heavens, the sound of something stirring awake, something vast, something ancient, something no living being had heard since the birth of time. Armand felt it in his bones. Gilor felt it as fuel. Humanity felt it as dread. The Watchers felt it as the first breath of inevitable reckoning. The corruption of heaven's guardians had reached its threshold. The giant's pride had begun to reshape the world, and the earth itself, burdened beyond its measure, finally cried out. The age of quiet rebellion was ending. Judgment was coming. The earth had always moved with quiet purpose, shifting beneath the slow rhythm of seasons, responding gently to wind, rain, and the footsteps of living creatures. But now, its movement carried a different tone, heavier, unsettled, as though creation itself struggled to bear the weight of the world's unraveling. What had begun as subtle ripples beneath the soil now rose into tremors felt across entire valleys. Stones cracked without warning. Hills groaned in the night. Rivers twisted unpredictably, as if trying to flee from burdens they had no words to express. Humanity felt this change with growing fear. Fires burned longer in their hearths, but did little to calm the unease that settled into their bones. Children woke with tears on their cheeks, dreaming of storms that had not yet formed. Elders spoke in hushed tones, sensing a cosmic tension thickening the air. Even the animals became frantic, migrating in erratic patterns, abandoning long-kept nesting grounds, crying out in voices that trembled with instinctual dread. But no one felt the earth's cry more profoundly than Armin. Whenever he stepped across the land, he sensed vibrations that had nothing to do with his colossal weight. It was as if the soil spoke to him not in words, but in pulses of pain and warning. The mountains trembled beneath his palms when he touched them. Rivers surged when he knelt beside their banks. Trees shivered when he walked through the forests, their leaves rustling not in greeting but in caution. He did not share these sensations with his mother, for he feared the sorrow it would bring her. But deep within, he knew the truth. The earth was responding to the imbalance created by the mingling of realms. The giant's presence, powerful, unnatural, magnificent, had stretched creation beyond its intended limits, and now, like a vessel filled to bursting, the world groaned beneath the strain. Gilor and his followers, however, interpreted the trembling land differently. This is the earth acknowledging its new rulers. Gilor proclaimed one morning as he stood atop a cracked hillside. His voice boomed across the valley, stirring dust clouds at his feet. The ground trembles because it feels our strength. It senses our destiny. The giants surrounding him nodded, their enormous forms casting jagged shadows across the fractured earth. They interpreted every tremor as validation, every distant thunderclap as applause from the heavens. Armin stood among them only briefly, listening with a sinking heart. "This is not reverence," he said quietly. "It is warning." Gilor scoffed. "You hear fear in every sound, Armin. Perhaps that is because you fear your own greatness." Armin said nothing, but in the pit of his being, he felt the truth like a bruise. Greatness meant nothing if it brought ruin. Far from the giants' gathering, the watchers felt the earth's cry as a spiritual weight pressing against their fading radiance. Their connection to creation, once clear and resonant, had become twisted, fragmented. They could feel suffering in the rivers, imbalance in the sky, discord in the mountains, and with each passing day, their celestial forms dimmed further, as though the world's anguish drew the light from their once brilliant wings. One evening, as darkness pooled beneath the horizon, Arakiel wandered to a cliff overlooking a forest that had once thrived in vibrant harmony. Now its leaves drooped, its roots curled like clenched fists. The air hummed with tension, thick as storm clouds. Sarah approached him slowly, her footsteps careful on the brittle earth. "You look troubled," she whispered, though she already knew why. Arakiel closed his eyes. "The earth is crying, Sarah. It groans beneath what we have done. We were meant to guide humanity toward light, yet we have dragged them and ourselves into shadow." Sarah stepped beside him, her gaze following the trembling treetops. "Can it be undone?" Arakiel exhaled, the sound catching like a broken note. "I do not know, but heaven listens. And when the earth cries out, heaven answers." Sarah's heart tightened. With mercy, Arakiel did not reply, for deep in the heavens, beyond mortal sight, the divine realm stirred in silence, a silence far heavier than before. And though no thunder fell from the sky, no blinding light tore the firmament, every watcher felt the shift. It was the beginning of something irreversible, something entwined with destiny and judgment. Meanwhile, among humanity, signs of imbalance grew more visible each day. Crops failed in some lands, while others grew unnaturally large. Storms flickered along the edges of the horizon, forming shapes that looked almost sentient. Earthquakes left jagged scars across once stable plains, and everywhere, whispers echoed, "The earth is speaking." Some claimed it was anger, others said it was fear, but the wise, the very few who still listened to the ancient rhythms of creation, knew it was neither. It was a plea rising from the wounded heart of the world, and the heavens, still silent, were drawing near to answer it. The storms began at the edges of the world, quiet at first, mere ripples of dark cloud drifting across distant horizons. But there was something unnatural in their formation, something ancient in their movement. They spiraled in slow, deliberate arcs, gathering strength without wind, drawn together as if by an unseen command. Nights grew longer, cooler, heavy with the scent of rain not yet fallen. Lightning flickered deep within cloudbanks like the pulse of a slumbering giant. Humanity watched these ominous signs with growing dread, sensing that the world itself was preparing for a reckoning. Animals reacted long before the giants or the watchers fully understood the magnitude of what was awakening. Herds abandoned their grazing grounds and fled toward the inner valleys. Birds flew in frantic circles before vanishing into distant forests. Wolves and great cats, normally territorial and fierce, began to travel in uneasy packs, their instincts sharper than any prophecy spoken aloud. Even the insects behaved strangely, emerging from the soil, only to burrow again immediately, as though the earth's surface no longer felt safe. Yet, still, Gilor's clan interpreted every omen as a herald of their imminent dominion. Creation trembles because it recognizes power, Gilor told his followers as they stood among the towering stone structures they had raised. The storms gathered to witness the rise of kings. His words ignited the giants' hearts like sparks on dry grass. Pride shimmered in their luminous eyes. They felt unstoppable, invincible beings, born not just to live upon the earth, but to shape it according to their will. Armin alone stood apart from their exultation. He watched the storms coil with quiet dread. He felt the tremors beneath his feet deepen with each passing day. When he touched the earth, he sensed a fear so immense it made his breath catch. The ground beneath him seemed to whisper a single message: "This cannot continue." One afternoon, when the sky flickered with lightning that bore no thunder, Armin approached Arakiel on a barren hilltop. The Watcher stood with his wings folded tight, their once radiant glow now dimmed to a faint, weary shimmer. He looked older, if such a thing could be said of a celestial being, like someone who had witnessed too much and carried it all without rest. "Tell me what you feel," Armin said quietly. Arakiel closed his eyes, as though the truth itself weighed too heavily to meet directly. "The earth is crying out against us, against what has been done, against what will be done, if this path continues." Armin stared at him, the question in his heart too heavy for words. Arakiel answered it before it was spoken. "Heaven hears," he whispered. "It hears, and it prepares to act." Armin felt the world tilt around him. Then judgment comes, for the Watchers, for the giants, for me. Arakiel's voice trembled. Judgment comes for all who have unbalanced creation. None of us may escape the consequences of our choices. A deep rumble rolled across the valley, then not thunder, not an earthquake, but something older, deeper. The sound vibrated in Armin's bones, resonating with a strange familiarity, as though calling a part of him he did not want awakened. The skies darkened visibly, clouds spiraling in unnatural patterns. Arakiel lifted his face toward the heavens, sorrow shadowing his features. "It begins," he murmured. The Watchers gathered in secret places as the signs intensified. Their conversations became desperate, scattered with fear and regret. They spoke of the laws they had broken, the attachments they had nurtured, the knowledge they had given, the beings they had brought into existence. Some watchers wept radiance dripping from their eyes like liquid silver. Others grew angry, defiant, unwilling to accept the judgment they knew was approaching. But none could deny the truth. They had fractured the balance between heaven and earth, and the fracture had become a wound, and the wound was becoming a storm. Humanity, though unaware of the spiritual battle unfolding beyond their perception, sensed instinctively that greater forces were moving. Tribes halted their wars, compelled by fear rather than peace. Fires burned through the night as people prayed, whispered, wept. They begged the heavens for mercy without knowing why. Even the Nephilim, those colossal children of forbidden union, felt a pressure building within them. Their hearts throbbed with a restless heat. Their strength surged uncontrollably. Some felt rage without cause. Others felt dread without explanation. But all sensed that something immense was descending upon the world. Something even their tremendous might could not withstand. And in the center of that rising tension, the storms thickened into spirals, vast enough to blot out the horizon. The earth had cried out, heaven had heard, and the answer was drawing near. The storms finally broke, not with rain, nor with wind, nor with the familiar roar of earthly thunder, but with a sound so profound that every creature, every river, every mountain felt it tremble through their very being. It was not a noise that came from the sky. It came from everywhere at once, as though creation itself exhaled after holding its breath for too long. The heavens had opened, not yet in judgment, but in warning. Armand felt the sound before he heard it. It pulsed in his bones, vibrated in the marrow of his tremendous limbs, thrummed beneath his feet like the echo of a giant's heartbeat. He staggered slightly, an action unimaginable for someone of his colossal strength. His mother watched from a distance, fear tightening her face as she saw her mighty son falter. "Armand!" she cried, running toward him, though she knew her steps could never bridge the distance in time. He steadied himself, eyes wide, breath shallow. "Do you feel it?" he whispered, voice trembling like a distant avalanche. "The storm?" Sarah asked. "No," Armand said, turning slowly toward the horizon where the clouds spiraled into a vast, churning vortex of color and shadow. Something else. Something above the storm. Far across the plains, Gilor and his warriors of stone halted their training as the sound rolled over them. Gilor's smile faltered for the first time. His confidence, so unshakable, flickered. "This is—" He stopped. He did not know what this was. Behind him, the giants shifted uneasily. Their luminous eyes scanned the darkening sky, sensing a presence far greater than their own. For the first time since their rise to power, they felt small. The watchers felt it too. Arakiel fell to one knee, wings trembling with a weight that pressed down from the heavens, like the memory of a forgotten oath. Serial clutched his chest as though the very essence within him had been stirred by an unseen hand. Penemu's glowing eyes dimmed as he whispered a name not spoken since the dawn of creation. "It is the voice," he murmured, barely audible. "The voice behind all things." Azazel, once defiant, staggered backward, dread carving cracks through the pride he had worn like armor. "No," he hissed. "It cannot be. It cannot. Come now." But it was coming, the voice silent yet deafening, gentle yet crushing, moved across the entire earth at once. It did not speak in words, for words were far too small. It spoke in presence, in gravity, in the raw weight of truth pressing through every hidden corner of existence. It called forth the truth of all things, the purity of creation, the fracture of rebellion, the cost of disobedience. Humanity fell to the ground, trembling, tears flowing without understanding. They cried out in reverence and terror alike, their spirits instinctively recognizing the nearness of the divine. The Nephilim roared in agony or defiance, clutching their massive heads as the voice reverberated through the angelic fragments within them. They were beings born of heaven's brilliance and earth's dust, now caught between a call that neither realm had intended for them. Amen sank to his knees, hands digging into the soil as the world shook beneath him. "What is happening?" he cried, voice cracking. Arakiel appeared at Sarah's side, his wings flickering like dying flame. He looked upon Amen, not as a watcher observing his charge, but as a father seeing his child caught in the tide of a cosmic reckoning. "Heaven answers the earth's cry," Arakiel whispered. Amen lifted his gaze toward the storm, toward the spiraling sky that glowed with an otherworldly radiance, as though light itself was gathering for descent. "Is it judgment?" he asked, voice trembling like the first break of a fractured mountain. Arakiel closed his eyes. Not yet, but soon. The storms intensified, the vortex widening until it stretched across the horizon. Lightning erupted silently within the swirling clouds, vibrant and unnatural white, silver, gold, hues unseen since the dawn of time. Winds rushed outward in concentric waves, flattening trees, bending mountainsides, carving shapes into the landscape as though the air itself had become a sculptor. And then, for a moment, the world fell still. No wind, no birds, no trembling earth, no sound at all. A stillness so absolute, it was almost holy. In that silence, a soft glow appeared within the heart of the storm. First, a single point of light, piercing through the darkness like the first star ever born. Then, another and another. A cluster of radiance forming something like a gate, or a wound in the sky, or a window into a realm too pure for mortal sight. Sarah fell to her knees, overwhelmed. Arakiel bowed his head so deeply his forehead touched the earth. Gilor stepped back in awe and fury, sensing his dominance slipping from him like sand through open fingers. Amen felt tears gather in his eyes, not from fear, but from the vastness of what approached. For through that widening glow, shapes began to emerge. Not watchers, not giants, not humans, but beings older than time, wrapped in brilliance that made the watchers' light look like fading embers. Their presence bent the air, reshaped the very breath of the world. Heaven was no longer silent. The stage was set. The earth had cried out. Judgment was descending. The sky had opened like a vast, trembling curtain, revealing a radiance no mortal tongue could ever name. As the light poured through the widening breach, the world below fell into a hushed reverence. Even the storms, frantic moments before, now circled the celestial gate in obedient spirals, as though recognizing a sovereignty woven into creation itself. The air thickened with awe. Every creature felt it, every bird, every tree, every trembling human heart. Even the Nephilim, towering embodiments of forbidden power, stood frozen beneath the splendor. From within the radiance, shapes advanced silhouettes before flame, shadow wrapped in brilliance. They were not like the Watchers. The Watchers had descended gently, clothed in the soft glow of guidance. These beings emerged with majesty so overwhelming, it bent the fabric of the world around them. Their presence pressed upon creation like a tide of eternity, shifting the air, warping the light, causing stones to hum with ancient memory. The heavenly council had arrived. Arakiel fell prostrate at once, wings collapsing around him like the petals of a withering flower. The other watchers, scattered across the hills and valleys, did the same wherever they stood, their radiance barely flickering compared to the blazing figures above. They trembled not from fear alone, but from the piercing recognition that the realm they had abandoned now gazed upon them, seeing every choice, every secret longing, every step away from the divine order. "Arakiel," Sarah whispered, terrified at the sight of the council's descent. "What are they?" His voice cracked as he answered. "They are the firstborn of the heavens. The ones who stood before the stars were lit. The guardians of law, of creation, of the balance we have broken." A great stillness fell as the council stepped fully into the mortal realm. The light dimmed enough to make their forms visible, tall beyond measure, wings like layered galaxies unfurling behind them, faces veiled by radiance to spare the world their full glory. Each movement they made sent ripples through the air, bending trees, stirring the earth, causing even mountains to quiver. The leader stepped forward, a being whose presence radiated both infinite compassion and unyielding authority. His outline glowed with a fierce purity, and when he raised a hand, the storm released a single, resonant chord that vibrated across the valley like the echo of creation's first breath. A voice followed deep as the foundation of the world, gentle as a mother's comfort, terrifying as the justice embedded in the fabric of existence. Watchers, you who were appointed guardians of humankind. The words were not spoken. They were felt, carried through earth, sky, and soul. Why have you abandoned the law entrusted to you? Across the land, watchers collapsed beneath the gravity of the question. Their wings dimmed, their faces fell, their beings trembled. Sariel cried out, covering his face with his hands. Penemu pressed his forehead to the ground. Azazel clenched his fists, pride warring with the crushing weight of truth. Arakiel's voice cracked as he answered, not aloud, but from the depths of his spirit. We loved too deeply. The leader of the council looked upon him, radiance pulsing gently. Love does not destroy order. Desire unchecked does. Armin watched this exchange with a heart that felt too large for his chest. He did not understand all that was unfolding, but he felt the tension, felt it like a blade balanced upon the edge of the world. His colossal hands clenched the earth, as if searching for stability. Gilor, meanwhile, stood rigid with fury. His luminous eyes blazed at the council, defiance burning through his immense frame. They judge us as if we are nothing, he hissed to his followers. But without us, this world would be weak, helpless. We are the future. But his voice trembled, betraying the fear hidden beneath the bravado. The council turned their gaze upon the giants. A low murmur coursed through the valley, like an ancient wind awakening. Children born of forbidden union, towering echoes of celestial rebellion. Their voices washed over the Nephilim like waves of fire and ice. You stand as the consequence of disobedience, not the fruit of divine design. Armin felt the words pierce him, though they held no malice, only truth so absolute it stung like lightning. Gilor roared, the sound shaking cliffs. We are not mistakes, we are kings. But the council did not look upon him with anger. They looked with sorrow. You were born not for dominion, the leader said, but for a purpose yet unknown to yourselves, a purpose shaped by choices not your own. The giants bristled. Confusion rippled through their ranks. Armin stepped forward, trembling. What is to become of us? The council's radiance dimmed slightly, as though they mourned the answer. A time of reckoning approaches. The earth cries for relief. The balance must be restored. A shudder rolled through the land at those words. Sarah clutched her hands to her chest. Arakiel's wings fell limp at his sides. Even Gilor faltered, and as the council's presence deepened, the valley braced itself, for the weight of divine judgment was only beginning to descend. The radiance of the heavenly council settled over the valley like a second atmosphere, dense and luminous, pressing upon every soul with a gravity that made even the air difficult to draw. The giants, so accustomed to towering above all living things, now felt dwarfed, reduced to trembling silhouettes beneath a splendor they could neither comprehend nor withstand. Even Gilor, who had bragged of kingship, of destiny, of dominion, now stood frozen as though pinned in place by the weight of eternity. The beings of the council moved with harmony that defied earthly logic, shifting like light refracted through crystal, each motion echoing through time and space. Behind them, the breach in the sky shimmered, its edges trembling as if strained by the immense holiness pouring through. Though they gave no physical command, nature itself bowed. Winds stilled, mountains quieted, rivers hushed their roaring. Then the leader of the council extended a hand toward the watchers, those once radiant guardians who now knelt in shadows of their own making. "You descended with purpose." The voice resonated, weaving directly into the fibers of their beings. "But you traded purpose for desire, wisdom for emotion, obedience for longing." Azazel shook beneath that judgment, his once proud frame bent. "We sought to help them," he whispered hoarsely. "We saw them struggling. We wished to give them strength." "Strength given without restraint becomes corruption," the council answered. "Knowledge granted without discernment becomes a snare." A ripple of sorrow flowed through their luminous forms. "You did not raise humanity. You burdened it." Penamue began to weep openly, silver tears darkening the earth beneath him. Sariel murmured prayers, half-remembered from before the dawn of stars. Arakiel remained silent, his grief too deep for sound. Then the council turned toward the Nephilim. The giants recoiled instinctively. A pressure, gentle yet irresistible, pressed upon them. Some fell to one knee, others trembled violently. Only Armin remained upright, though even he shuddered beneath the force of that divine regard. Born of two realms, yet belonging to neither, the council intoned, "Your existence is a breach, not a blessing. But you did not choose to be." Armin's breath caught. He expected condemnation, perhaps obliteration, but instead compassion radiated from the council, sorrow wrapping around them like soft fire. "You were shaped by forbidden love," they continued, "but not by hatred. And thus, you are not condemned for being. You are judged for what you will choose." The giants exchanged uncertain glances. Never had they imagined that their towering strength, their burgeoning pride, their growing thirst for dominion could be questioned at such a scale, not merely by men or watchers, but by the very fabric of heaven. Gilor's jaw tightened. "We choose our own destiny," he growled, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the fear beneath. The council's radiance brightened slightly, so subtly, yet enough to make even Gilor shield his eyes. "Destiny shaped by defiance leads to ruin," they said. "But destiny chosen with humility may yet alter the course of the world." Armin stepped forward, his massive form casting a long, trembling shadow across the trembling ground. "If there is judgment coming," he said quietly, "tell us how to stand. Tell us how to spare the world." His voice cracked with a blend of fear, hope, and desperation. The council regarded him with a stillness that felt like the pause before dawn. "The earth cries out not only because of the watchers," they answered, "but because of your rising ambitions. You shake the mountains. You command storms. You test the boundaries of creation with your strength. If you continue on this path, there will be no world left to save." A hushed dread settled over the giants. Even the air held its breath. Gilor's pride sparked violently. "Are we to live in chains then? Silent? Small? Afraid of our own might?" "No," the council replied with a sadness that dimmed even the radiance around them. "You are to live with responsibility. A responsibility your hearts have not yet learned to bear." Lightning crackled across the sky, not natural lightning, but spiritual force manifesting as golden fissures of power. The breach in the heavens pulsed, widening, contracting, as though preparing for an act that would reshape history. Arakiel lifted his face, anguish carved into every line of his being. "What will heaven do?" he asked, though dread already whispered the answer within his soul. For the first time, the council's leader bowed his head. "The balance must be restored," he said. "The earth must be relieved of its suffering." A pause, heavy as the weight of worlds. The age of unchecked rebellion must end. The watchers trembled. The giants stiffened. Sarah covered her mouth with trembling hands, and Armin felt his heart fracture. The storm above shuddered with renewed intensity. The breach pulsed once more. Judgment inevitable, colossal, divine, was descending. The valley seemed to hold its breath as the heavenly council's last words rippled through creation. The age of unchecked rebellion must end. Those words did not merely echo, they took root, sinking into the soil, the mountains, the rivers, the hearts of every being present. Even the wind struggled to move beneath the weight of impending judgment. Armin felt the pressure first, not upon his skin, but within his spirit. The celestial resonance inherited from his father stirred violently, reacting to the nearness of the divine. His breath grew shallow, his immense chest rising and falling with effort. Around him, other giants clutched at their throats or staggered backward, their bodies trembling beneath the radiance gathering above. Gilor roared, not out of courage but out of fear. The sound rolled across the valley, powerful enough to send flocks scattering from distant hills. Yet the roar held no authority here. It was swallowed instantly by the overwhelming might of the council's presence. "Stand firm," Gilor bellowed at his clan. "Do not bow, do not break." But even as he shouted, his knees buckled. His enormous frame crashed to the earth, hands sinking deep into the trembling soil. Rage contorted his face, but he could not rise. No strength born of heaven or earth could defy this force. Armin watched him, sorrow tightening his heart. Pride had carried Gilor far, but pride had also blinded him. And now, pride could not save him. Arakiel lifted his face toward the council, wings dragging against the ground. Once he had stood tall among celestial hosts. Now he knelt, trembling. "Have mercy," he whispered. "If judgment must come, let it fall upon us, the watchers who transgressed, not upon the children who did not choose their birth." A murmur of grief swept through the watchers at his plea. Sariel lowered his head, tears slipping down his radiant cheek. Penimue pressed his palms into the ground, as if trying to anchor himself to a world he feared losing. Even Azazel, the proud, the defiant, closed his eyes in a rare moment of humility. But the council did not respond to Arakiel's plea, not yet. Instead, their radiance deepened, shifting hues like a sunrise compressed into a single moment. The light they emitted was no longer merely illumination. It was truth incarnate. It seeped into shadows, exposed everything that had been hidden, revealed the fractures that had splintered creation. And through that unbearable brilliance, a symbol began to form behind them, geometric, ancient, vast as the sky. Circles within circles. Wings upon wings. An emblem only heaven could bear, glowing with the authority of the one who had spoken stars into being. Armin stared at it, his heart pounding so fiercely he thought his chest might break. He did not know what the symbol meant, but he understood what it signified. Something final was being invoked. Sarah trembled, unable to stand beneath the pressure of divine presence. She fell to her knees, reaching out blindly for her son. Armin bent toward her, shielding her with one massive arm. Even now, in the presence of cosmic authority, his first instinct was to protect. The council's leader lifted his hand, and the entire valley dimmed. Every torch, every ember, every glow of the giant's radiant eyes flickered. Light itself bowed. A voice layered with ages, resonant with eternity, spoke again. "The decree is set. The earth must be cleansed." The words struck like a seismic wave. The ground shook. The mountains groaned. The skies tore open wider, revealing storms coiling with unrestrained power. Armin felt the weight of those words crush against him. Cleanse the earth. Cleanse it of what? The Nephilim? The Watchers? Humanity? Everything? He turned to Arakiel, desperate. "Tell me, this is not what it sounds like." Arakiel's expression was hollow, devastated. "It is what it sounds like." Gilor shouted again, voice raw with fury. "We will not be erased. Let them come. We will tear the heavens from the sky." But his roar was empty now. It held no power, No defiance could rise high enough to touch the decree already sealed in the halls of eternity. The council's leader lowered his hand. The sky answered. Thunder rolled, not the thunder of storms, but a cosmic tremor, the trembling of creation preparing to shift. The heavens filled with the sound of rushing water, though no ocean was near. A rumbling grew along the distant horizon. The air thickened with moisture. Clouds spiraled into towering columns. Something immense was coming. Something world-changing. Something only heaven could summon. The council spoke once more, and their judgment fell like a sentence written across the spine of the earth. Prepare, for the flood of reckoning draws near. Armin's heart dropped. Sarah gasped. The watchers bowed in anguished silence. And Gilor, for the first time, looked truly afraid. The valley shook. The winds howled. The ancient world had been warned. Judgment was no longer approaching. It had begun. The world held its breath as the decree of judgment echoed through creation. It was not a moment marked by a single sound or tremor. It was a shift in the very pulse of existence. The air thickened, the skies darkened, and a strange silence settled across mountains and plains, as though every living thing sensed the approach of an age-ending storm. Even the sun seemed hesitant to rise fully, its light dimming behind veils of gathering cloud. Armin stood frozen in the valley where the heavenly council had appeared, his colossal frame trembling. The echo of their words, the flood of reckoning draws near, reverberated through his bones, sharper than any blade. Around him, giants muttered in disbelief or roared in defiance. Some cried out in fear. Others simply stared skyward, their luminous eyes wide with a dread no strength could shield them from. Gilor paced back and forth, fury rolling off him like heat from a wildfire. "They cannot erase us," he growled, his voice cracking under the strain of chaos swelling within. "We are the apex of creation. We were born to rule," but his proclamations rang hollow now. No words could compete with the cosmic decree that had been spoken. No pride could drown out the tremor running through the earth. Arakiel approached Armin slowly, wings dimmed, shoulders heavy with a sorrow too ancient for mortal understanding. "We must leave this place," he murmured. "The council has begun its withdrawal. Soon the heavens will act." Armin turned his gaze toward the breach in the sky, still swirling, still glowing with divine radiance. The council's forms were already fading, ascending toward the great tier in the firmament. Their presence lifted from the earth like a tide receding from the shore. Yet the weight of their decree lingered, pressing into the soil, into the wind, into the hearts of all who remained. "What will happen to the world?" Armin asked, his voice barely more than a shaken whisper. Arakiel's eyes shimmered with grief. "It will be washed, cleansed, reborn. And us?" Armin's voice cracked. "What of the giants?" Arakiel hesitated. That hesitation was an answer in itself. Sarah hurried across the trembling ground toward them, her breath coming fast, her eyes brimming with fear. Armin bent instinctively, lifting her carefully into the cradle of his hands. She touched his cheek, her small fingers trembling. "My son," she whispered, "whatever comes, you must hold fast to who you are, not what others have made you believe." Armin closed his eyes, pressing his forehead gently to her. "I will not let the world lose you," he vowed. But even as he spoke the words, a deeper truth twisted inside him. He might not have the power to keep that promise, for already the world was changing. The wind shifted abruptly, cold and sharp. The first drizzle of unnatural rain began to fall, heavy droplets that struck the earth with resounding thuds, soaking the soil instantly. The scent of the air transformed, thickening with moisture that did not belong to the season. Dark clouds spiraled into the horizon, merging into a vast canopy of shadow. Gilor and his followers watched the shift with rising panic. One of the giants, a massive youth, with eyes like burning gold, stepped forward, voice trembling. "What do? We fight it," Gilor declared, though uncertainty flickered across his face. "We face whatever comes. No storm can match our strength." But even as he spoke, lightning split the sky, not white or gold, but a brilliant, blinding silver. The thunder that followed cracked the mountainside. Boulders tumbled down the slopes, trees snapped like twigs, and the ground shuddered with a force that sent both humans and giants sprawling. Armen steadied himself, lifting Sira high above the splintering earth. His heart pounded as the heavens roared again. Another bolt carving through the sky like a divine blade. "It has begun," Arakiel whispered. And indeed it had. Rain intensified, falling in torrents that blurred the horizon. Rivers swelled within minutes, leaping their banks with ravenous hunger. Streams that once trickled gently through meadows now churned with violent, frothing currents. Hillsides collapsed under the deluge. Pits opened in the earth, swallowing stones and soil alike. Humanity fled in every direction, families clutching their children, elders crying out prayers, into a sky that no longer resembled anything gentle or familiar. The watchers scattered as well, some ascending toward the peaks in agony, others falling to their knees in despair. Their light flickered like dying embers. The giants stood amidst it all, caught between pride and fear, unsure which path to take. Some roared into the storm, shaking their fists at the heavens. Others turned and ran, their colossal limbs cutting desperate paths through the flooding land. Armen did neither. He held his mother close, his breath shaking, his eyes fixed upon the ravaged horizon. He felt the earth crumble, felt the rivers rise, felt the sky split apart as judgment poured down without restraint. The war of the ancient world had begun not by blade or flame, but by the unstoppable force of heaven's decree. And Armen knew, with a certainty that chilled his massive frame, that he would soon be forced to choose. Would he stand against the storm, or would he stand against those who sought to defy it? The deluge strengthened with terrifying speed, as if the heavens had cast aside every restraint they once held. What began as heavy rain soon fell in sheets, walls of water that blurred the sky and swallowed the land in a murky, relentless torrent. Rivers became roaring serpents, devouring forests in their path, valleys transformed into churning seas. Even the mountains trembled under the assault, streams pouring down their sides in silver cascades that glowed with the strange luminosity of divine wrath. Armen waded through the rising floodwaters with Sarah held safely against his shoulder. Even with his colossal strength, each step felt labored. The water rose to his knees, then to his waist. Whole trees floated past him, swept along by currents strong enough to tear apart the roots of ancient oaks. The screams of humanity echoed across the chaos, voices calling for lost children, for shelter, for mercy. "Armen," Sarah shouted over the roar of the storm, "we must find higher ground." "Yes," he answered, though his voice was thick with dread. "But the waters rise faster than the hills." He lifted his gaze and saw the giants struggling across the plain. Some had already been swept off their feet, their massive bodies carried downstream like fallen statues. Others clawed at cliffsides, trying to gain footing against the unrelenting surge. They roared not in defiance now, but in desperation. Gilor, his pride finally cracking, tried to gather his followers. "To the mountains!" he shouted, though the thunder nearly swallowed his voice. "We must climb, climb." The giants obeyed, but even their monumental strides faltered beneath the fury of the flood. A wave, the height of a house, crashed over them, sending several tumbling into the deluge. Their cries shook the valley, a sound so immense and forlorn that even the storm seemed to mourn the fall of such beings. Armen watched them with horror. Though he had opposed Gilor's arrogance, he felt no triumph, only sorrow. These giants were his kin, born of the same forbidden thread woven through heaven and earth. Their strength, which once shook mountains, now faltered against a force greater than anything they had ever imagined. Arakiel fought his way toward Amun, his wings soaked, his light flickering weakly. "Amun!" he cried. "You must go take Sarah and climb. There is a ridge beyond the northern pass. It may hold long enough." Amun held Sarah tighter. "What of the others?" Arakiel's face twisted in anguish. "We cannot save them all. We may not be able to save any of them, but you, please, you must survive." Amun's voice rose in desperation. "What of you?" Arakiel's eyes, once bright as starlight, dimmed with a sorrow that pierced deeper than any blade. "Judgment is not for you alone," he said quietly. "It is for us. For what we did. My place is to face what I have brought upon the world." A bolt of lightning struck a nearby cliff, splitting it in two. A torrent of water cascaded from the fracture, sweeping trees, animals, and debris into the raging current. Sarah clutched Amun's face. "Listen to him, Amun. You cannot save the world, only what is within your grasp." Amun felt torn between the two greatest loves in his life, his mother, whose gentleness anchored him, and his father, whose sorrow carved a hollow ache inside his chest. But there was no time to choose. The waters surged higher still, now brushing against Amun's ribs. The land was disappearing beneath the rising ocean. He turned toward the northern ridge. "Hold tightly," he whispered to Sarah. Then he looked once more at Arakiel. "I will come back for you." Arakiel offered a weary smile. "If fate allows." Then the watcher stepped back, letting the waters lap against his legs as he turned to face the tumultuous horizon, a lone figure of light, flickering against the storm, diminished, yet unbroken. Amun moved toward the pass with long, determined strides. Each step was a battle against the current. Waves slammed into him, cold and sharp, trying to wrench Sarah from his grasp. But he held fast, pushing forward until he reached the base of the ridge. Behind him, the world he had known was drowning. Mountainsides crumbled. Valleys became oceans. The sky was a swirling tempest of divine fury. Silver lightning carving through blackened clouds. The cries of giants mingled with the roar of the storm, a symphony of fallen pride and fading breaths. Amun climbed, muscles trembling, fingers digging into the slick stone, but the higher he ascended, the more he saw. The flood was not local. It was everywhere. A vast, consuming sea, rising to swallow the ancient world. And in that terrible realization, a question clawed its way into his soul. If heaven had decreed this destruction, what purpose remained for those who survived? He did not know the answer, but he knew he had to reach the summit before the waters did. Amun climbed the ridge with the force of desperation surging through every colossal muscle. The stones, slick with relentless rain, crumbled beneath his grip. Water cascaded beside him in violent streams, tearing soil from the earth and hurling debris down the mountainside. Yet he pressed upward, carrying Sarah as though she weighed nothing, though the weight of his fear felt heavier than the flood itself. Below them, the ancient world was dissolving into chaos. Forests that had stood for centuries were now submerged, only the tallest branches visible above the churning sea. Villages vanished beneath surging waves, their fires extinguished in an instant. Giants struggled against the current, their mighty limbs cutting through water that rose faster than even they could outpace. Some disappeared beneath the surface, with thunderous splashes, their roars echoing only for a breath before silence claimed them. Amun reached a narrow ledge carved naturally into the mountainside and paused to catch a breath. Sarah, soaked and trembling, clung to him tightly. Yet even in her terror, her eyes reflected a steadfastness that pierced him through. "Amun," she whispered, voice shivering, "you must climb higher. The waters, they will not stop." He looked over his shoulder, heart pounding with the enormity of truth. The flood was rising with impossible speed, faster than any storm, faster than any tide, faster than nature itself could account for. This was no natural disaster. This was the unraveling of an age. And he, massive, powerful, half-born of heaven, felt helpless before it. "I will not let it take you," he said through clenched teeth. She pressed her forehead to his chest. "Then, we climb." With a determined breath, Armin pushed upward once more, the ledge cracking beneath each footfall. The mountain itself seemed to resist the storm, trembling but enduring, its ancient form defying the flood's fury. Lightning cracked above, illuminating the silhouette of the world being swallowed whole. As he climbed, Armin saw movement below, giants clinging to cliffs, fighting their way upward. Among them he spotted Gilor. The once fearless leader was now soaked, bruised, struggling to keep his footing as the current surged around him. His eyes, usually blazing with pride, now burned with raw fear. He caught sight of Armin above him. "Help me!" Gilor cried, his voice drowned almost instantly by wind and water. Armin hesitated. All their conflict, all their arguments, all the bitterness between them flared inside him. Gilor had led countless giants toward destruction. He had pushed them into pride, into violence, into rebellion. And yet, he was still one of them. "Armin!" Sarah called urgently. The waters were rising again. Still, Armin crouched as far as he dared, one hand pressed into the rock, the other reaching downward. "Take my hand," he shouted. Gilor reached, but another surge of water slammed into him. He lost his grip, sliding down the wet stone. Armin lunged, fingers scraping against Gilor's forearm. For a breath, they connected. Then the water tore Gilor away. His eyes widened in terror as the current dragged him downward, sweeping his colossal body into the whirling depths below. His roar echoed through the valley, then was drowned entirely by the thunder. Armin froze, chest heaving, rain mixing with the tears he did not know he shed. Sarah gripped his shoulder, her voice soft. "You tried." He swallowed hard. "It wasn't enough. No one could save him," she whispered. "Not even you." Armin turned his gaze back to the flood, watching as the sea rose over the last remnants of the plain. The giants, those who hadn't climbed quickly enough, vanished beneath the waves. Their shadows flickered once, twice, and were gone. A deep, distant rumbling vibrated through the air, an ominous reminder that the storm had not finished its work. The sky churned with power, lightning spiderwebbing through roiling clouds. Far above the storm, Armin could still glimpse the faint remnants of the heavenly breach, glowing like a wound in the sky. The judgment was not simply the flood. It was the severing of heaven's bond with earth. Sarah tugged at him gently. "We have to keep moving." Armin nodded, lifting her into his arms once more. He climbed higher still toward the summit where the waters might not reach, where the tempest howled like a living creature, where the final remnants of the ancient world clung to life like fragile roots in dissolving soil. At last, they reached a rocky outcrop that rose above the chaos. From there, Armin could see the vast expanse of the flood stretching to the horizon, an endless sea swallowing forests, mountains, cities, memories. He stood there panting, soaked, trembling, holding the only thing in the world he could still protect. Below him, the world he knew was dying. But above him, the heavens glowed faintly as though watching, as though waiting. Armin felt something stir deep within him, something he did not yet understand. Not strength, not pride, something quieter, something enduring. Resolve. Whatever happened next, he would not let the last light of his world fade. He would endure. He would fight for whatever future remained, even if he had to stand alone atop a drowning world. When the dawn finally arrived, it came without warmth, without color, without the gentle promise that morning once carried. It rose instead behind a vast, an endless sheet of grey light diffused through the thick clouds that still pressed down upon the drowned world like a divine shroud. Armen stood upon the solitary outcrop of stone that remained above the waterline, Sarah beside him, her small hand resting in the shadow of his colossal one. Together, they gazed out over an expanse that no longer resembled the earth they had known. Where valleys once stretched between rolling hills, there was now only the heaving surface of a boundless sea. Where forests once whispered with wind and birdsong, there was only the quiet rippling of currents and the far-off groan of mountains dying beneath the weight of water. Human settlements, once flickering with firelight and life, had vanished without a trace. Even the towering silhouettes of the giants, those mighty beings whose shadows once darkened the plains, were nowhere to be seen. The world had been washed clean, not by chance, not by nature, but by decree. Armen felt the truth of it in the hollow ache that pulsed through his chest. The flood was not merely an ending, it was a reset, a great unmaking, a severing of the bond between heaven and earth, between watchers and mortals, between the old world and whatever fragile future might one day rise from the waters. Sarah leaned against him, trembling. "How long will it last?" she whispered. Armen shook his head. "I don't know, but it will not stop until the heavens will it too." His voice cracked. He wished he could offer comfort, but even his tremendous strength felt small in the face of such devastation. He had witnessed storms that shattered mountains, battles that shook the earth, but nothing had ever felt so final, so absolute as the silence left behind by the flood. Then, from the drowning horizon, a faint glow shimmered soft, golden, wavering. Armen narrowed his eyes. "Do you see that?" Sarah followed his gaze. The glow grew stronger, spreading like a rising dawn, though the sun had not yet gained its color. A shape emerged within it. At first, it was indistinct. A ripple in the light, a silhouette drifting across the surface of the waters. But slowly, it sharpened into the form of a figure. A watcher, not Arakiel, not Sariel, not Penamue. A being Armen did not recognize, taller, more radiant, untouched by earthly corruption. His wings glowed with the brilliance of morning stars, each feather shimmering with hues no mortal eyes had ever witnessed. When he stepped upon what appeared to be the very surface of the water, the sea stilled beneath him. Armen's breath caught. Sarah clutched his arm. "What? What is he?" "I don't know," Armen whispered. "But he is not like the others." The watcher approached slowly, the light around him flickering like a great lantern carried by the wind. He stopped at the base of the rocky outcrop, lifting his face to meet Armen's gaze. His eyes, vast, ancient, weightless, held neither judgment nor condemnation, only a profound, immeasurable sorrow. "Armen," he said, and the giant's name echoed through the ruined air like a gentle chord. "How do you know my name?" Armen asked, voice trembling despite his size. "I know all who are born of the breach between realms," the watcher replied, "and I come bearing news of those who remained faithful despite their fall." Armen's heart stilled. "My father Arakiel? Is he?" The watcher's luminous expression softened. He stood where many fled. He faced the storm not as a rebel, but as one who regretted deeply what had been wrought. His spirit was taken up before the final wave. Armen's knees buckled, a sound escaping him that was neither sob nor sigh, but something caught between grief and fragile relief. Sarah pressed her forehead against his arm, tears streaming quietly down her face. "Why are we spared?" Armen asked, lifting his gaze to the watcher. "Why am I spared?" The watcher stepped closer, the sea calming at his feet. "Because judgment is not vengeance, it is restoration. And though you were born of forbidden union, your heart never yielded to pride. You stood apart from the corruption of your kin. You showed mercy where they sought dominion. You protected when they sought power." Armen bowed his head, overwhelmed. "I tried. but I failed to save them. Armin bowed his head. Salvation was not yours to give, the Watcher said quietly. Your task now is survival and remembrance. The words seemed to settle upon the mountaintop like seeds carried by the wind. Survival. Remembrance. Armin looked again over the vast waters, feeling the truth of those words sink into him like a weight and like a calling. What comes next? Sarah asked, her voice trembling yet brave. The Watcher turned his gaze toward the horizon, where clouds were beginning to thin, allowing faint rays of light to pierce through. The flood will continue until the world is made new. But remnants will endure souls who will carry forward a gentler lineage, one guided not by pride, but by humility. He looked back to Armin. And you, son of two realms, must choose whether the strength in your bones will bow to sorrow or rise to purpose. A long silence followed. Then Armin straightened slowly, the wind brushing against his colossal frame. His grief did not vanish, but something steadier formed beneath it. Resolve, duty, the faintest spark of hope. He stared out across the waters, and the Watcher's words echoed within him, shaping something like destiny. Survive. Remember. Endure. Far below, the flood churned onward, relentless. Far above, the heavens sealed their breach, and between the two, caught in the thin space left behind Armin, felt the fragile heartbeat of a world waiting to be reborn. Days passed, if days still had meaning in a world where the sun remained veiled behind storm-wrought clouds. Light rose and fell in muted pulses, soft and directionless, as though the heavens themselves were mourning the earth they once illuminated with joy. Armin and Sarah remained upon the highest reachable stone, watching the waters swirl below with slow, relentless certainty. The flood did not recede, it expanded, swallowing the last visible remnants of the old world until even the distant peaks were nothing more than shadows beneath a shifting sea. The Watcher who had visited them did not return. His departure had been as quiet as his arrival, a fading glow across the water, a whisper of wings that stirred the air with something like comfort, something like sorrow. Armin often looked for him in the horizon's shimmering haze, but the storm had swallowed all signs of heaven for the time being. Though the flood was all around them, there remained a profound silence at the center of each day. No birds called, no creatures stirred, no fires crackled in the night. In that stillness, Sarah often leaned into Armin, seeking the comfort of warmth and presence, amid an emptiness that stretched in every direction. "Do you think others survived?" she asked. One dawn, as pale light filtered through the clouds, Armin considered the question with a heaviness he could not hide. If they did, they would be scattered, alone on higher ground. But the waters have climbed far above the mountains. There are few places left. Sarah swallowed, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Then we are truly alone. Armin looked down at her, frail, trembling, yet stronger in spirit than any towering giant. "Not truly," he said softly. "As long as we breathe, the world is not empty." But even as he spoke those words, a part of him wondered how long the world intended them to endure. Though Armin could survive the storm's wrath far longer than any mortal, Sarah's survival depended entirely on his strength, his vigilance, his ability to shield her from the unrelenting cold and wet. He wrapped his great hand around her shoulders, offering warmth where the wind bit cruelly. In moments like this, he felt the fragile tether between their realms, her small human life, precious as a candle flame, his giant's form capable of sheltering her yet helpless before the judgment descending upon them. One night, as the winds raged, Sarah stirred awake with a quiet gasp. Armin immediately looked down at her. "What is it?" "I dreamed," she whispered, voice soft and shaken. I dreamed of the old world, of my mother's village, of the river where you stood when I first saw you. Everything was whole, calm, alive. Armin's throat tightened. Dreams hold memories that the flood cannot drown. Sarah shook her head. No, it wasn't just memory. It felt like a promise. She looked up at him. Armin, do you think the world will ever be restored? He wanted to answer with certainty. But certainty belonged to heaven, and heaven had fallen silent. I think, he said gently, that the world was not destroyed to end life, but to begin anew. If the council meant only to wipe all things away, they would not have spared us. Sarah let out a shaky breath. Then maybe we still have a purpose. Armin nodded slowly. We must. Otherwise, why endure? As if hearing their quiet exchange, the wind shifted. Not in the violent, twisting way it had done in previous storms, but with a soft, cooling brush that carried the faintest hint of freshness. Armin lifted his head. The clouds above seemed thinner, their edges softening. For the first time in many days, a sliver of sunlight broke through a thin golden ray, touching the turbulent sea. Sarah gasped. Armin, look. Armin stood, cradling her against his chest as he turned to face the horizon. The storm was changing. Not ending. Not yet, but changing. The sky's hue shifted from bruised grey to muted silver. The rain softened into mist. The sea, though vast and restless, lost its violent churn. It was the first sign of easing. The world was beginning to breathe again. Armin felt something inside him loosen a knot of dread that had sat heavy since the flood began. Sarah touched the sunlight with trembling fingers, her eyes widening as the warmth brushed her skin. It's beautiful, she murmured. Yes, Armin said softly, though his heart still pounded with uncertainty. But we must be cautious. This may be only a moment. Still, that moment lingered. Armin lowered Sarah to the rock beside him and stood tall, facing the shifting horizon. With each breath he took, he felt a strange, stirring something new, something unchanged by the storm. A sense that the flood, for all its devastation, was not the final verdict, but a beginning written in the language of sorrow. The world had been silenced, but not undone, and from that silence, something was preparing to rise. He did not yet know what, but he knew, deep in the core of his being, that the next chapter of creation was approaching, and he and Sarah, fragile and mighty together, would be the first to step into it. The flood's fury began to ebb, not with the abruptness of a storm dying, but with the long, slow exhale of a world that had wept until it could weep no more. A strange gentleness crept into the air, a softness that felt foreign after the roaring violence that had swallowed the earth. The clouds remained thick, yet patches of muted light drifted between them like pale lanterns wandering across the sky. The sea still surged restlessly, but its tides felt less hostile, less eager to consume. Armin sensed the change long before he could name it. Though the waters remained high, their pressure against the mountain stone lessened. The tremors beneath the earth quieted. Even the wind fell into a calmer rhythm, no longer laced with the cold bite of destruction. Something in the storm's heart had softened. He stood on the ridge, scanning the vast horizon, while Sarah slept at his side, curled beneath the shelter of his arm. She had grown weaker in the days since the flood began. Though he shielded her as best he could, exhaustion seeped into her bones. Still, she endured frail, human, and astonishingly resilient. Armin reached out gently, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. "Hold on," he whispered. "We are almost through the worst of it." He hoped heaven could hear the prayer beneath his words. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the steady breathing of the sea, until a distant sound carried across the water. It was soft at first, barely more than a tremor in the air, but Armin's sharpened senses caught it immediately. He lifted his head, eyes narrowing. There it was again, a resonance, a low hum, a vibration older than language. He rose slowly, moving toward the edge of the ledge. Sarah stirred, pushing herself upright with effort. "Armon, what is it?" "I hear something," he murmured. "Something alive." They both scanned the shifting waters. At first, there was nothing. Only the endless, grey expanse of the flood. But then, a shape appeared, small, distant, moving steadily toward them. Armon's heart quickened. He had seen giants fall, watchers vanish, men disappear beneath the waves. Never had he expected anything living to approach after such devastation. As the shape drew nearer, it became clearer. A vessel of some kind, crude in form but sturdy. A long, curving hull rising from the water, its sides stained with rain and time. It creaked softly as waves lifted it, then lowered it again. Sarah covered her mouth. A boat? Armon stepped closer to the precipice, his eyes widening as the vessel angled itself in their direction, as though guided by unseen hands. When it drifted close enough for them to see, Sarah let out a soft gasp. People, living people, clinging to the deck, moving about with purpose, faces weary yet determined. There were men, women, children, survivors, gathered beneath a makeshift shelter of wood and cloth, and at the helm stood a single figure, older than the rest, with eyes that carried the depth of storms and the softness of dawn. An elder, a shepherd of the remnant. Armon's breath caught. Could it be? Were these the ones heaven had chosen to preserve? The lineage meant to rebuild the world? He watched them in stunned silence, hardly daring to believe his eyes. The elder lifted his gaze as the boat passed below the ridge. For a moment, his eyes met Armon's human eyes, gazing upon a giant who rose from the mountain like a monument. There was no fear in the elder's expression, only understanding, recognition, as though he saw not a monster, but a being caught between fate and sorrow. Sarah whispered, "Do you think they see us?" "Yes," Armon said softly. "They do." The elder bowed his head, not in submission, but in acknowledgement of a story too vast for either realm to explain. Then, with quiet purpose, he returned to guiding the vessel along its ordained path. Armon and Sarah watched until the boat drifted beyond the curvature of the mountain, swallowed by mist. When it vanished entirely, Sarah released a trembling breath. "We are not alone," she whispered. "No," Armon said, feeling something warm kindle inside him. "We never were." They sat together on the ledge, letting the truth settle over them like a fragile balm. The flood had not erased everything. It had not claimed all life. Somewhere in that vessel, the future drifted, guided by divine protection, preserved for a purpose not yet revealed. And Armon realized something then. The Watcher's words were not a warning. They were a charge. Survive. Remember. Endure. He felt the weight of destiny shift subtly inside him, no longer heavy and suffocating, but steady like a stone placed deliberately at the foundation of something not yet built. Below them, the waters continued their slow rise, but they no longer felt like an enemy. They felt like transition, like cleansing, like the final chapter before a dawn not yet written. Armon lifted his face toward the thinning clouds. He inhaled deeply as the air changed, growing lighter, fresher, touched by the faintest fragrance of distant soil. A new world was coming, and he would be ready to stand within it. The floodwaters lingered for many days more, but their violence had passed. What remained was not the roaring tempest of heaven's judgment, but a vast and solemn stillness, a world caught between endings and beginnings. Armon and Sarah lived upon the narrow ridge like two souls suspended above eternity, watching as the waters slowly calmed into a great mirror that reflected a sky now softening toward peace. When the clouds finally parted, The sunlight emerged cautiously, as though unsure whether it still had a place in this remade world. Its golden beams touched the sea with a fragile warmth, revealing the faint shimmer of land far beneath the surface. The air felt different, cleaner, quieter, as though creation itself had exhaled. Sarah leaned against Armin's side, her energy fragile yet returning. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Beautiful, yes, but also sorrowful." Armin gazed across the endless waters, his heart heavy with memories of all that had been lost. The giants, his kin, his people had vanished beneath the waves, their voices silenced, their shadows erased. The Watcher's beings who once glowed with celestial dignity had faced their judgment, some carried away, others lost, and humanity reduced to a whisper, a remnant safeguarded upon the waves. "I never imagined the world could be so quiet," Armin murmured. Sarah nodded. "It feels like the breath after a long cry." Armin looked down at her, awed by the resilience she carried. Though the flood had destroyed everything she knew, she still found room for wonder. He envied that softness. He cherished it. As days continued, the waters gradually receded. First by inches, then by spans. Rocks previously hidden beneath the sea rose into view, then small outcroppings of land, then the faint shadows of distant hills. It was a slow, almost reverent unveiling, as if the world wished to reveal itself carefully after such devastation. Armin helped Sarah climb down from the high ridge once the slopes had dried enough to walk safely. They descended cautiously, each step taking them farther from the mountaintop refuge and closer to a world reborn. When they reached the shoreline, new, unshaped, untouched, Sarah knelt in the wet sand and let the receding tide wash over her fingers. "It feels alive," she murmured. "It is alive," Armin said softly, watching the water swirl around her hand. "The world is waking." In the following days, life began to murmur in faint, unexpected ways. Birds returned first, a small flock gliding across the sky, their wings glowing in the sunlight. Their calls echoed with a hopeful clarity that made Sarah lift her face with tears in her eyes. Then came the sprouting of new plants along the shore, tiny green shoots pushing bravely through the softened soil, trembling in the breeze. Armin knelt beside one of them, marveling at its delicate stem. "Life returns," he whispered, "even after everything." Sarah smiled. "It always does." Armin watched the young plant for a long moment, realizing something profound. The flood had not been destruction for destruction's sake. It had been a cleansing, a mourning, a renewal, and as the world healed, so too would its stories. The memory of the giants would not be erased, not wholly. Their existence had carved itself into the bones of creation, into the myths that would someday be whispered by generations yet unborn. The Nephilim would become echoes, legends, warnings. Their towering shadows would linger in the corners of human memory, shaping tales of heroes and monsters, gods and demons. And Armin, last of his kind, felt the weight of that truth settle on him like a mantle. He did not know what his place would be in this new world. He did not know how long he and Sarah would survive, or whether any of the Watchers remained to guide them. But he knew this. The story of the giants was not gone. It lived in him, in his breath, in his sorrow, in his strength. "Armin," Sarah said gently, touching his arm, "what troubles you?" He looked toward the horizon, where land was slowly revealing itself. "The world will need memory," he said. "It will need stories to warn, to teach. If the giants are forgotten, their mistakes may be repeated." Sarah nodded. "Then you must carry the memory. You must be the last echo of their story." Armin felt a tremor of purpose rise in his chest. Not pride, not sorrow. Something steadier. "I will," he said. Together, They walked the emerging shoreline, watching as the sea drew back to reveal the bones of the earth, a world washed clean, waiting for its next chapter. And Armand Giant, survivor, witness, knew he would walk into that chapter with reverence and resolve. The old world had ended, but the story had not. As the waters retreated further, the contours of a renewed world began to take shape. Gentle slopes emerged, like memories resurfacing from the deep. Riverbeds carved fresh paths through soft earth. Valleys that once echoed with the thunderous steps of giants now lay quiet, washed smooth by the flood's cleansing hand. Everything was familiar, yet changed, so profoundly altered that the land itself seemed younger, as though creation had returned to its earliest breath. Armin and Sarah walked together along the muddy shoreline that stretched wider with each passing sunrise. The air carried scents he had never known before. New soil, untouched vegetation, the cool sweetness of beginnings. Every sound felt amplified in the absence of the ancient world. The whisper of wind through tender blades of grass, the rhythmic collapse of waves against stone, the distant cry of a lone bird heralding its claim upon the empty sky. Sarah's steps were slow but steady. Strength had begun returning to her limbs, thin and fragile as they were, and Armin watched her with a protective tenderness that reached deeper than the sorrow still lingering in his chest. "We survived this," she murmured, stopping beside a pool of clear water left by the tide. "Do you realize how unlikely that is? How much was lost?" Armin knelt beside her, his reflection a broad, solemn shape in the pool's trembling surface. "We survived because heaven chose for something to remain." He touched the water gently, so gently that it barely rippled beneath his massive fingertip. "But surviving is not enough. We must learn why we were spared." Sarah looked up at him, her dark eyes searching. "Do you think there is still a purpose for us?" Armin turned his gaze toward the horizon, where faint hills shimmered through the thinning mist. "I must believe there is," he said quietly. "The flood washed away the pride of the giants, the disobedience of the watchers, the corruption that spread across the earth. If we are still here, then something remains unfinished." He paused, watching a small fish dart through the shallows. Life was returning, hesitantly, tentatively, but unmistakably. "I am the last of my kind," Armin continued. "But perhaps being the last means being entrusted with what the first could not bear." Sarah reached for his hand, resting her palm against a single giant knuckle. "You carry the memory," she whispered. "And memory shapes the future." He nodded, though the weight of her words pressed heavily upon him. As they walked further inland, they discovered the first signs of new creation. Small birds fluttered between branches that had only begun to leaf. Tiny mammals scurried across rocks still slick with moisture. Green tendrils of vines crawled up broken boulders, claiming them as anchors for their climb toward the Sunday. Everything was new, fragile, vulnerable, and Armin felt an ache in his chest as he realized that his immense presence might one day be the very thing this delicate world feared. "Sarah," he said, pausing as they reached a rise overlooking the wide basin below. "I am too large for this world now. The land feels small beneath my steps. The trees tremble when I pass. If I walk among the new life, I may harm what the flood sought to heal." Sarah turned toward him, her hair lifting softly in the breeze. "Armand, you are gentle, kinder than any giant before you. You harm nothing unless forced to defend. Yet my existence alone disturbs the balance," he answered, gazing out across the quiet expanse. "The giants were born of rebellion. Their strength reshaped the world and strained it. I feel that strain even now, like a bruise beneath the soil." Sarah stepped closer, placing her hand against his vast palm. Then reshape the world differently, she whispered, not through force, but through presence, through remembrance. Armin looked down at her, struck by the gentle wisdom woven into her words. You believe I can belong in this new world, she smiled faintly. I believe the new world is wide enough for someone who loves it. Her faith settled into him like a seed, tiny, but with the power to transform mountains. As the sun dipped low, streaking the sky with gold and rose, Armin lifted Sarah onto his shoulder and gazed out over the land. The world was quiet, but not empty, broken, but not hopeless. It breathed like a child newly awakened, stretching its limbs after a long and fitful sleep. And in that sacred, trembling silence, Armin made a vow not aloud, but in the quiet chambers of his heart. He would wander this reborn earth without claiming it. He would guard without ruling. He would remember without resenting. He would carry the echo of the giants not as a threat, but as a reminder of what must never rise again. The flood had washed away their shadows, but one remained gentle, mourning, and determined. A shadow that would not dominate the land, but watch over it. A soft breeze swept across the new grass, brushing against him like a blessing. Armin exhaled deeply. Yes, he whispered at last. There is a place for me in this world. In time, the land beneath Armin's feet began to feel less like the grave of a lost world and more like the cradle of something new. The soil, once waterlogged and trembling, gradually hardened beneath the warmth of clearer skies. Slender shoots pushed bravely through the earth-grass first, then wildflowers, then saplings whose tender leaves unfurled like tiny banners of hope. Birds returned in growing numbers, their calls stitching music into the quiet air. Even the wind seemed to reclaim its gentle rhythm, no longer burdened with the weight of divine judgment. Armin walked carefully wherever they traveled, mindful of the fragility blooming around him. He learned to step softly, to rest lightly, to lower his massive hands with reverence when touching the tender green that fought its way into the light. Sarah often watched him with a quiet smile, marveling at the gentleness of a being crafted with such immense strength. One evening, as the sun melted into gold along the horizon, the two of them rested upon a ridge overlooking a valley that had begun to flourish. Pools of bright water reflected the sky like shards of fallen heaven. Young trees swayed in the breeze, and animals gathered cautiously at the water's edge, sensing the possibility of life renewed. Sarah leaned against Armin's arm, her expression softened by the glow of dusk. This place feels like a promise, she whispered. Armin nodded slowly. The world wishes to heal, even after everything. Sarah studied his face, its solemn lines, its quiet sorrow, its fierce tenderness. And you? She asked softly. Do you wish to heal? Armin looked out across the valley, eyes lingering on the delicate life rising where destruction had thundered. I don't know if someone like me ever truly heals, he admitted, but I can honor what was lost. I can keep watch over what survives. A silence fell between them, not heavy, but contemplative. The kind of silence that arises only in the presence of sacred things. Sarah reached for his hand, resting her palm atop one of his fingers. You are not a shadow of the giants, she said. You are their final echo. And echoes do not dominate, they remind. Her words settled deep within him. He had feared his existence would forever stir dread in the reborn world, that his great form would haunt the land like a relic of wrath. But her perspective shifted something inside him, something long buried, something that flickered like the first spark of dawn. As darkness gathered, Sarah fell asleep at his side, curled in the shelter of his arm. Armin remained awake, gazing over the valley, listening to the quiet breaths of the earth. He felt something new, stirring a sense of guardianship, of quiet stewardship. Not command, not dominion, but presence. After some time, a faint shimmer of light appeared at the edge of the valley, moving softly between the trees. Armin stiffened, uncertain, but as the glow approached, it revealed itself not as a threat, but as a familiar form, radiant yet subdued. A watcher whose light had softened to match the gentleness of the renewed world. Armin rose slowly. "You returned." The watcher bowed his head. "Only for a moment. The veil between worlds has thinned with the cleansing, but it will soon strengthen again. Before it does, I came to tell you this. You are not forgotten." Armin swallowed, the words striking something fragile within him. "Do others remember us? The giants?" The watcher's expression held neither joy nor sorrow, only truth. "In time, the stories of your kind will be told by those who never saw you. Some will call you heroes, others monsters. Most will call you myth. But you, Armin, you will carry the truth, and the earth will know your footsteps." Armin lowered his gaze. What of the watchers who fell? They faced judgment according to the measure of their choices, the watcher said softly. Some were taken up, some were stripped of their radiance, some remain elsewhere. His voice dimmed. Love does not erase consequence, but neither does consequence erase love. Armin felt his breath tremble. "And the world? Will it rise again?" "It must," the watcher replied. "The Creator has woven resilience into the fabric of all living things. This flood is not the end, it is a beginning." The light around him began to fade. "Remember who you are," the watcher murmured. "Remember why you survived." Then he was gone, dissolving into starlight that drifted like pollen on the night breeze. Armin stood motionless, feeling the weight and tenderness of the encounter settle into his bones. He returned to Sarah's side, lowering himself gently to the ground. She stirred, half awake, and whispered, "Is something wrong?" "No," he said softly, gazing up at the stars beginning to pierce the dark. "Something is right." Sarah nestled against him again, and together they watched the sky, a sky cleansed of storm and shadow, a sky ready to write new stories upon the earth below. As the constellations shimmered into place, Armin felt the truth settle over him like a mantle. The age of the giants had ended, but the echo of their story, his story, would move forward into every generation that followed, not as a threat, not as a terror, but as a quiet reminder of power, pride, mercy, and rebirth. And as long as he walked the earth, that echo would remain alive.